Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I am your host, John DeLynn. It is September 6th, 2022, and I have to say, I was talking about this just a few minutes ago. I think you are in store for the person that I think I would list as the number one person I would, up to this date, ever want to interview who's alive on Mormon Stories podcast. And I mean that sincerely. And I hope you guys agree. We are here today to interview Patrick Mason, Patrick Q. Mason. Hey, Patrick.
Hey, John. It's great to be here. Hey, Margie.
Yeah, and Margie's with us. Hey, Margie.
Hey there, babe. Dreams are coming true today.
Yeah, totally.
I was going to say, you need a longer list. If I'm at the top, you really need a better list.
No, I'm sticking by it. Let me go ahead and just kind of read Patrick's bio. First of all, Patrick Q. Mason holds the Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture at Utah State University. Go Aggies, my alma mater 3 times over. Patrick has written or edited several books, including Proclaim Peace, The Restoration's Answer to an Age of Conflict, Mormonism and Violence, The Battles of Zion, What is Mormonism, A Student's Introduction, Out of Obscurity, Directions of Mormon Studies, like The Mormon Menace. And those aren't even the books that we thought about talking about today. Just a year or two ago, this book came out, Restoration, God's Call to the 21st Century World. That's the book that I've read, that I'm prepared to kind of integrate into our discussion today. And I've already mentioned Proclaim Peace, which is brand new, right?
Yeah, just a few months ago. Yep.
And it's a joint publication between the Maxwell Institute and Deseret Book.
Yep. Co-authored with David Pulsfer.
David Pulsfer, yeah. So many books, Patrick, but Patrick is, he's an author, he's a scholar. He has a bachelor's degree in history from Brigham Young University, two master's degrees from Notre Dame, one in international peace studies and one in history, and then a PhD in history from University of Notre Dame.
Go Irish.
Go Irish, right? Yeah. And, he was a Fulbright Scholar in Romania in 2015, past president of the Mormon History Association. He's a professor at Utah State. And he's frequently consulted by the national and international media on stories related to Mormon history and culture. And he teaches courses at USU on Mormonism, American religious history, and religion, violence, and peace building. What I love about Patrick is that, they're even including the top leaders within the Mormon Church, apostles, first presidency members, even people in the church history department, Maxwell Institute, wherever. I would not be able to name a person who has more of a command of the history and more of a finger on the pulse of Mormon scholarship, who is also self-describes as faithful and who can speak from a lens of kind of boots on the ground, hearts and emotions engaged, and as Margie would say, integrated as Patrick Mason. So, and I'm sure there are people Patrick, who you would put on that list.
Way above me on that list.
But that's my list, so I need to meet more people, apparently.
No, that's kind. Thanks.
Anyway, that was a super long introduction, but we're super glad you're here, Patrick.
Thanks, John.
Anything you want to say just as an opening or a disclaimer? You want to correct, add?
No, that was embarrassingly long. But
welcome to Mormon Stories. Embarrassingly long.
Yeah. The subtitle, right?
Yeah. I should add that my dear friend Chris Thomas told me to mention that you might be the only person, aside from Richard Bushman, to have been named to 2 separate Mormon studies chairs.
I think that's true. It's a pretty small club.
And shout out to Chris Thomas, who's a dear friend to us both. A mutual
Absolutely.
friend. Yeah.
I love Chris, who just had a grandbaby. I don't know if you heard that. Yeah.
No.
Really exciting. So
congrats, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we're going to do this interview in 3 parts. Patrick's generously given us all day, and we're going to do an abbreviated version of Patrick's Mormon story not because he doesn't deserve an 8-hour interview, but because we may never get you for a full day again. And I have a million questions, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask us some questions because admittedly, there have been times where I've been critical or harsh, not just of you, but of the church or of many of your colleagues. And so I just thought it would be fun to be able to turn the tables and let you ask us questions.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. So those are the 3 parts. It's kind of an abbreviated Patrick Mason story is part 1, hopefully under 2 hours. Part 2 will be a gazillion questions that I and a bunch of my listeners and viewers have for Patrick, Margie too. And then part 3 will be Patrick turn the tables. All right?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
So Patrick Mason, what would you like to share? Where should we begin about your Mormon story?
Well, it starts at the very beginning. I mean, I was born and raised in the church. I was born mostly grew up in Sandy. We moved around a lot when I was in elementary school, but mostly grew up in Sandy, Utah. And I had a very, in some ways, I think a kind of idyllic Mormon childhood, very comfortable, very, my parents are just great people, both faithful members of the church. But also, when my dad passed away 12 years ago, one of the things, my older brother wrote the obituary, and one of the things that he wrote about my dad is that my dad had, I forget the exact language, that he had a ton of gospel knowledge, loved the church, served in the church, but the phrase that my brother used was that he wore it lightly, that it was never heavy-handed, it was never over the top. He and my mom, both beloved in the ward and in the stake, still till today. Like I say, he passed away 12 years ago, but it was just a very comfortable upbringing, but also very Mormon in the sense that almost everybody I knew was Mormon. A suburb of Salt Lake, and most of my friends growing up were Mormon, and being in the church, going to church, doing church activities. That was just the whole world that I was raised in, and it was very, very comfortable.
Were your parents both born in the covenant? Are they both pioneer heritage kind of Mormons?
Yeah, my dad is. So my dad's ancestry does go back to Nauvoo, but we never told pioneer stories, so we weren't like a pioneer family in any sense. So and I don't know why exactly, but that just was an important part of what we talked about, or sort of our identity. My mom's side, they joined the church in Mississippi right around the turn of the 20th century, and then moved to follow the missionaries who baptized them, moved to Idaho. And so my mom grew up in southeastern Idaho in St. Anthony, and then came down to the University of Utah and met my dad there. But her parents were not active in the church growing up. And she has 2 siblings who also were not. So my mom was the only one who participated in the church as a teenager, kind of just did it by herself. I think she found value in it. She enjoyed it. Her parents never did. Her parents were never hostile to the church. I think we'd call them Jack Mormon. I don't know if we even use that term anymore, but growing up, that would have been the term. And actually, one of my actually really tender memories was when I was called on my mission. By that point, my grandparents had come down from Idaho and were living with us. They were a lot older, and they weren't in great health, so they were living in our home. And so I was called on a mission, and we went to the stake president's office for me to be set apart. And they came with us to the office, and the stake president he knew my parents very well, of course, but he didn't know my grandparents. He just assumed that they were lifelong members of the church. I mean, they hadn't darkened the door of the church for years and years and years. But again, super supportive and never hostile. Just wasn't a part of their life. And when I was set apart as a missionary, as the custom is, they invite all the men in the room to come, and my grandfather hesitated. Of course, he did not hold the Melchizedek priesthood, as far as I know. Certainly wasn't active in the church. But the stake president kind of urged him to come up, and nobody wanted to make a scene. And so he was there, and he laid his hands on my head and helped set me apart as a missionary. Despite
without the priesthood.
I don't know for sure. He may have been ordained an elder at some point. Certainly had not been active in the church for decades, right? But it was very sweet. It was very tender, and I think very fitting and very appropriate that he was there in that circle of love, kind of sending me off in my mission. That's beautiful.
Did you say both your parents were Utes?
They were. Yeah, both graduated from the U.
Okay, but you ended up at BYU. I guess we'll get there.
And my dad kind of apostatized. At some point, he turned his sports loyalties to the Y.
He apostatized from
the U to the Y, athletics, right? They were always proud to have graduated from the U. And my mom is still a proud U, but at some point, maybe it was when like BYU got really good at football, but we were at the national championship game, the Holiday Bowl, when BYU won the national championship in 1984.
Wow.
So we were big BYU athletics family growing up. And so my two older brothers both went to BYU. My oldest brother eventually transferred to the U and graduated from the U. Actually, my two older brothers teach at BYU right now, one in history, one in English.
What?
Yeah.
You have two brothers teaching at BYU right now?
Yeah. So my oldest brother, Matt, teaches in the history department. He teaches early American history, focuses on the history of slavery.
What?
And then my brother, Nick, teaches British literature, 18th, 19th century British literature in the English department. And then we have a younger brother who's probably the smartest one of all. He went into banking and mortgages and stuff like that. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Margie's nodding her head. That's because that area of literature is...
That's what you love.
Thomas Hardy and
Yeah. That's what he he teaches all the Jane Austen classes and all that. And so no, he's a brilliant scholar of British literature. He led their European studies program for years. They've done study abroad over in England and stuff like that.
Where did your two older brothers go to grad school? I'm just curious.
So the oldest one did his PhD at University of Maryland, studied with one of the top historians of slavery there. And then Nick went to SUNY Stony Brook on Long Island.
Nice.
Yeah.
What was your dad's profession? And I shouldn't assume your mom was a stay-at-home mom, but that's usually the way it is. But
it wasn't actually. Okay. So they both graduated from the U. My dad was in business. He spent most of his life in the insurance industry. And then my mom was a social worker. She worked for the state of Utah doing Medicaid stuff. I always get Medicaid and Medicare mixed up, but doing Medicaid stuff. Oh. So she worked. She was never home full time. She had the double, triple burden of she worked full time. I think maybe for a while she was working like 30 hours a week, but she worked the whole time that I grew up, and then was taking care of all of us and was cleaning the house and doing all the stuff that women do.
Second shift, as they call it,
and third shift. Yeah. So she was. Whereas my dad, worked full time, and then he was always really involved in the church. I think he was. My brothers are 6 and 8 years older than me, so he was a beloved kind of young men's leader. I think when they were teenagers, and then by the time I was a teenager, he was my bishop, and he was really good at it. He was a great church leader, really sensitive, generous, knowledgeable. My perspective, even as a kid, was that he was really well respected.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 4 sons.
Four boys, no daughters. Yeah.
So your upbringing, your Mormon upbringing, I think you already said this, but like primary and young men's, young women's, and scouting, that
whole
sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Family home evenings and family scripture study.
Very intermittent. Even at the time, I always knew like when they'd had a lesson on family home evening or family scripture study, because then we would do it for a couple of weeks before we slipped out of the habit again. So it was definitely family meal, like that was sacred, right? Family dinner, we were going to be there, but family home evening and family scripture study was very uneven.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's pretty normal.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. So if you had to describe a little bit what your family culture kind of felt like in those, let's just say, childhood kind of years, how would you describe it? I'm curious if there were things that emerged maybe in differentiation from the church, like, education was really important, or reading. We had a family culture around reading. Anything that's like an extra or something.
Yeah.
Or was it really church-based?
Well, I mean, the church was just, I mean, it was like the undertone that sort of went underneath everything, right? And it was just, I mean, you were just going to go to church on Sunday, right? And then you were going to go to Young Men's on Tuesday or Wednesday night. I mean, it was just what we did as a family. But then on top of that, so both my parents, but I think especially my mom, felt really strongly about education. So we were all readers. My mom's a phenomenal piano player and organist. And so she insisted that we all take music lessons as well. It took for some of us a little bit more than others, but I played piano all the way through high school, and I'm decent. But there was a kind of culture of achievement, especially around academic achievement. None of us were great athletes or other things like that, but there was a sense of excellence, of really. She wanted us to get good grades. She wanted us to be Eagle Scouts, so she got 4 Eagle Scouts. We went through the system, and did that. But there was a real sense of like being excellent and trying to achieve things. And the church was a framework for doing a lot of that, but not all of it. The music and the education and all of that was all on the side.
Got it.
Yeah. So it's not. I mean, we always joke that. That she always said that she wanted us to be doctors, but she just wasn't specific enough, because 3 of us did become doctors, just not like the kind that become rich, right? so we have 3 PhDs in the family, but I really trace that back to and again, my younger brother is incredibly intelligent. He just went kind of more of the business route rather than the academic route, and but I really. That all comes back to our parents, but also so my mom really drove us towards achievement and excellence. But my dad, one of the things that I think we all appreciate about him, his whole life was in business and insurance and so forth. But he never forced us into that direction. He was very happy for us to do what we were interested in doing, and he was just extremely proud of us for doing and following the path that we followed. And I remember him giving a talk once. It was either my missionary farewell or homecoming, one or the other. But he talked about how he very much felt he had a deep testimony that we were all children of God, that we were all brothers and sisters. And so he said, "These 4 sons of mine, they're not my children, they're my brothers. And I'm just here for a few years to kind of help guide them and get them to wherever they need to go and wherever God needs to take them. But they're not mine. They're my brothers." And I think he was just happy to see us do well in whatever we chose to do well.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm loving how you're describing your family so far. As I think about a lot of people that end up in that chair, they're raised in homes that they sort of would describe as being more orthodox, maybe more hardcore, maybe more harsh, maybe more fear-based, maybe more shame-based, and maybe more rigid. And it sounds like, you use this analogy in maybe a slightly different way in Restoration, but there's this idea of religion being the meal, or there's the idea of the religion being like the leaven in the bread or the salt on the meal. And it sounds like while there was a frame or a structure of Mormonism, that it wasn't the meal. You weren't, living to be Mormon. Being Mormon was just the way that maybe your lives were framed?
Yeah, I think there's something to that, and maybe somewhere in between. I mean, there were definitely rules. Like we were, my parents felt really strongly about the Sabbath. So we were Sabbath keepers. So we didn't play with friends on the Sabbath. But we weren't. On the other hand, we weren't the stay in church clothes all day people, right? So it was kind of like it was a moderately rigorous. A term that I like just overall is kind of generous orthodoxy, and I feel like that's sort of what I was raised with.
And orthopraxy.
and orthopraxy very much. And so it was clear, like, it wasn't like if you go on a mission. I mean, all the talk was like when you go on a mission, right? So it was clear that like this is who we are as a family. But like I don't remember like much religious art on the walls. Maybe there was some a little bit, but and again, we weren't doing all the family scripture study and family home evening all the time. But for me, it was like. Seeing the way that my parents lived their life was enough. That was kind of like all the testimony I needed. Like that my dad, dedicated a lot of his free time to church service. And again, even as a kid, I could tell that made a difference in people's lives. And my mom, she was oftentimes in the Relief Society presidency or something like that. I mean, she was always taking somebody a meal. She was always, and even as a kid, it's kind of on the periphery, but you're also like, you're vaguely aware of what your parents are doing. And I was aware enough to know like, these are two people who are, they're out doing good and helping people. And like church is the framework through which they do that. And so like, this is the life that we have together.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I have a quick question around, kind of what it felt like for you being in, so you've described some of the culture of your family kind of around achievement, education, some structured. And I think, that can exist in a place of warmth, in a place of safety, in a place of connection. And that can be a real hustle for certain kids that, may be wired differently. How did it feel for you growing up in that family system? And what do you remember about your experience of having those expectations and feeling that?
Yeah, for me, it didn't feel oppressive. And I it's interesting. So my family that I grew up in, we were not, my parents weren't emotionally effusive. So even still today, like it's, my mom and I don't always say, I love you or whatever with every conversation. In my family now, so my wife, she did grow up with that. Like you never leave the door without saying, I love you and stuff like that. So she brought that into our family now. So I'm much more that way now than I was in my family growing up. But it was never questioned. I mean, it was a very safe environment, very, very stable. I think there were some things, as always, some things going on kind of behind the scenes. My dad lost his job a couple of times, and maybe now I know that my parents' marriage wasn't as easy as they made it look, but they hid that from the kids and things like that. From my perspective as a kid, it was entirely stable, and again, not much physical affection, but just like stability and like this is a safe place. And so, yeah, really high expectations. I think that, it's more his story than mine, but I think that was harder for my younger brother than for me. We had kind of too many groupings because my older brothers were 6 and 8 years older. So there was kind of them and then me and my little brother. And I was always high achieving in the areas that my mom cared about. So in music and in education. Those were not areas that my little brother naturally gravitated to. And so that was a tenser relationship, but actually they worked it out in the sense that in a lot of ways they were and remain closer in some ways emotionally because they had to work through some stuff because he wasn't sort of made in her image in the way that I more naturally was. But I think even I'm sure, again, it's his story, but I think he would say, even with that conflict that he had with my mom as a teenager, he knew it was a stable and safe and loving place. Yeah.
Thank you.
So in terms of the kind of teachings or beliefs in the home, let's just say we've already talked about the spectrum of like, let's just say fundamentalist or really orthodox versus more liberal or progressive. There's the sort of correlated stuff you learn, and then there's like dialogue and Sunstone. Talk about kind of spirituality / Mormon culture, orthodoxy not, in your home.
Definitely. I didn't know that there was a an intellectual world of Mormonism outside of like church produced material. So my parents were not dialogues on stone type people.
Were they aware of those things and critical of them, or did they not even know about them?
If they were aware of it, they never mentioned it.
Okay.
So my dad was, we always had a bookshelf with tons of church books. So he was born in 1941, so he came of age, in the 50s and the 60s, Bruce R. McConkie, kind of like at Deseret Books' heyday, when they were just pumping out all the stuff by general authorities and all this kind of stuff. And he read it all. His gospel literacy, and he also had a deep love of the scriptures. It was clear. Again, we didn't do family scripture study all that well, but you looked at this guy's scriptures, and he had a deep love affair with the scriptures, and so that was like those were the books that were kind of around me. It was all the the Orthodox kind of church Deseret book type and bookcraft and all that kind of stuff. But it was never foisted on us. It wasn't like, hey, let's sit down and read Bruce R. McConkie together. None of that. It was just kind of the books that were on the shelf. But yeah, if they were aware of some of these other currents, they certainly never let on. I honestly don't think they were, or it certainly wasn't a part of their life.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as you're growing up into your teen years, so your high school, what year did you graduate from high school?
94.
94.
Yeah.
Okay. So the September 6th would have happened your junior year.
Yeah.
Like, can you remember any of, and the Hoffman stuff would have happened probably while you were in middle school and you were living here.
Yeah.
So can you remember, as an Orthodox sort of Mormon in the bubble, can you remember any of the significant sort of troubling or other sorts of Mormon history events happening?
None of it. None of it registered on my radar at all.
The Hoffman bombings?
I think I was a little too young.
Yeah, okay.
A little too young for that to really register. My dad worked downtown, and so he talked later about how he was aware of all of that and so forth. But I think just age-wise, I was just, and even for the September 6th, so I went to BYU. I think if I'd been 2 or 3 years older, I would have been at BYU and it would have happened. I would have been aware of it. But like I said, I was a junior in high school. I was interested in being dumb. I was actually a really good student. So I was just doing dumb stuff with my friends, and I wasn't paying attention to any of that world. It just was not part of my galaxy at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So how would you describe your Mormon youth, your Mormon teen years? You could just say like everyone else's, or you can.
Yeah, I was a really good boy. I was a really good Mormon boy. So I kept all the rules, was very serious about it. I loved the church, loved the gospel. It was really good to me. Had great experiences in young men's. Really liked seminary, liked all my teachers, read the scriptures, fell in love with the scriptures as a teenager, prayed every day, morning and night. So it was, I was like all in, and it was very, very comfortable for me. And it was great. I mean, it's almost weird to say in this day and age, because everybody's got stuff, everybody's got baggage. Like I have no baggage from my Mormon upbringing. It's just a great ward with great youth leaders. Now again, as adult, you grow up and one of those leaders in particular who was really important for me. He had some trouble later on, and so you realize the world's a little more complex than you thought it was when you're 14. But I just had a great experience, and so I was on seminary council, and I mean, one of the ways that I describe myself, like I'm just naturally religious. Right? It's just like if there's a religious gene, and I know like scientists have like debated this, I've got it. Implanted, I compare myself to Nephi, not in the sense like actually Nephi annoys me in some ways, and I'm not like Nephi in lots of ways, but I'm like him in the sense that it just kind of like comes natural. It's not a struggle for me. It never was a struggle for me. like being religious was just like, they were the clothes that fit really well. And I had a structure and community and family that made that possible.
So oftentimes those teen years are kind of associated with some sort of identity struggle or conflict or turmoil, inner turmoil. Individuation. Yeah. Rebellion, wanting to, so did you have any internal conflicts that come to mind that you're comfortable sharing as a Mormon teen?
Very petty rebellions, very petty, like staying out too late. Driving really fast, and I probably shouldn't say
five over.
No, really fast. That's out of my system, fortunately. I probably shouldn't say this, but there's an overpass over I-215, and me and my buddies we used to go and urinate off of it, and I'm slightly embarrassed by that now, but we were 16 years old, right, and stuff. So it's like petty rebellion, harmless, never a sip of alcohol, no drugs. Not even interested. And none of my friends did any of that stuff, and we weren't like goody two shoes in the sense like we sat around talking about the church. We didn't. We were just like teenagers, but who were all church members, again, for whom it was basically comfort. It was like part of our life. It was our culture. It was everything. So we weren't rebelling against it. We were just like doing our thing. A lot of music, listening to a ton of. So if you would have asked my mom at the time, she would have been really worried about the music I was listening to because it was like, grunge, right? And stuff like, so it wasn't even like hardcore stuff. It was just, but tons of music. I was huge into the music scene in high school.
So name your 10 favorite bands in high school.
Pearl Jam, U2, REM, Big Country, Indigo Girls, Bruce Hornsby. Now, Radiohead, Uncle Tupelo. Now War on Drugs, Wilco, other bands, the Smiths, bands like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Kind of alt rock, grunge stuff. Yeah.
What other personal interests, hobbies were you really into in high school?
Hanging out with my friends and listening to music was like the main thing. And then, I've always been a big reader. And so a lot of reading.
What types of books in high school?
A lot of some serious stuff. I've always been interested in history from way back, and so I would read history books. But I've loved Lord of the Rings and that kind of stuff.
Which history books were you reading in high school, if you remember?
Boy,
like
that's a really good question.
Like Doris Kearns Goodwin?
No, nothing that serious.
Oh, okay.
It would have been stuff like some historical fiction, and I couldn't even name any titles. Fine. But yeah, but I was always reading, and I've always, especially growing up, played a ton of sports with my friends. I was always the worst one, like always, so if I got the religious gene, I did not get the athletic gene, but I've loved sports. That was the main thing that I did with my dad growing up was we watched sports together.
BYU, mostly
BYU and the Jazz.
Utah Jazz.
The Stockton and Malone era. And so that's what we would do. He would come home, we'd have dinner as a family, and more nights, if there was a game on, we were watching it.
Fun.
And while my mom cleaned the house and stuff like that. So again, I'd learned later that there was some tension there that I didn't see at the time. But yeah.
So as far as kind of shame that sometimes develops around law of chastity stuff, was that just completely not even a factor in your?
Well,
that you're comfortable sharing. No pressure to share.
I didn't kiss a girl till I was in college, not because I didn't want to. They weren't interested in me. I wasn't I wasn't the top on their list of desirability. So I went on dates and stuff like that, but I'd never had a girlfriend in high school. Again, not for lack of wanting one. So it was just hanging out with the guys all the time. So obviously I had I had very strong ideas about the law of chastity, about the dangers of breaking it, right? And but it wasn't even an option.
And sometimes there's, sometimes there's tension between a young man or woman and the bishop around things like pornography and masturbation.
Yeah. Well, I remember a very vivid memory of my childhood. My dad was my bishop basically all through my teenage years. So I remember he did one of the annual interviews in our living room, and he asked me if I masturbated. I think I was 15 or 16. And that was like to hear that word coming out of my dad's mouth was odd, and I didn't, but it was, but that's still he gave us the Boyd K. Packer, the Factory pamphlet,
yeah.
and stuff like that. But I don't think my parents ever gave us the sex talk. I'm pretty sure that they never gave. I think they outsourced that to the church, and I just took in whatever I learned at church.
Okay. When you talk about having that religious gene, I'm dying to know. Like when I was in high school, I loved seminary and I believed it was true, but I wanted my own testimony. And so for me, reading the Book of Mormon, Moroni's Promise, all that was a really serious thing. Did you ever sort of have that sort of thing where you're like, well, maybe my testimony is just inherited from my parents. I got to find out for myself.
For sure.
And did you have any doubts or, any of that?
I don't remember having any active doubts. Certainly, because that was taught to me, right? I mean, you got to get your own testimony, right? The Moroni's Promise and all that. So I did. I read the scriptures quite seriously. I think, with the 4 years of seminary, I completed the scripture reading for each 4 years. I'm sure that I prayed about the Book of Mormon. I'm sure that I did that as a high school student. I don't recall having a kind of life-changing spiritual experience confirming the truth of the Book of Mormon while I was in high school. My first experience like that came in the MTC, which maybe fast forward just a little bit, but this was I'm not a particularly mystical person. The Spirit doesn't actively talk to me a whole lot. I don't hear voices. I don't, things like that. So it's actually pretty rare that I get very distinct mystical or religious or kind of experiences. And I can sort of count them on my hand, the ones that I've had. But one of them, probably the most important and foundational experience of my life, kind of along the lines of what you were talking about, is I was in the MTC. We'd had a fireside that night. I think about Jesus Christ, and we were invited to get our own testimony of him. And so I went back to our dorm room, and I knelt by the side of my bed and very sincerely just poured out my heart in prayer. I don't know how long I was there on my knees, and had it was the most incredible kind of spiritual experience of my life, of this absolute outpouring of love and faith and knowledge, and this just absolute conviction that Jesus was my Savior. So I had that experience, on my knees by my bedside in the MTC. That was the first. Again, I lots of probably little experiences I would have described as spiritual experiences along the way, of feeling good and feeling confirmed in what I was doing. But that was the first time as a 19-year-old missionary where I felt that kind of direct communication from heaven.
How do you describe that? Like, what was that in your mind?
I mean, it's still. I can remember it still today. I mean, it still gives me, I could. Still kind of sends shivers down my spine. I mean, for me, I think it was, I believe that was pure communication from God. It was, certainly there was a kind of physical affect to it. I felt things in my body, felt a sense of warmth and I don't know, the tingles or whatever. But more than that, it was deeper than that. It was not just physiological. It was not just mental or intellectual. It was deeper and more profound than that. And it's sort of been at my core ever since.
So God and Holy Ghost combination?
Yeah, absolutely. No, for me, a witness of the Holy Ghost, for sure.
And what did you take away as an interpretation of that in terms of what it meant in your life? Or what was being testified of? Or
for me, that particular instance, and I think I said that was the first. That's not actually right, of the really powerful thing. I'd had a very distinct impression. I can still remember exactly where it was on the street. I didn't want to go to BYU. I wanted to go somewhere else. I was sort of interested in going back east to college or something like that. BYU was on my list because I felt like it should be. But I was on a campus visit down to BYU as a high school senior. I remember exactly where I was walking. I could point you to the place on the sidewalk where, out of nowhere, I got this distinct, very clear impression, like, go to BYU. So that was, and I did, and I was a good enough Mormon boy to say, okay. And so I did. I set aside all those other schools that I was interested in. I said, I'm going to go to BYU. And then in freshman religion class, I think it was a Book of Mormon class at BYU, the professor, the instructor, put in probably a videotape of Howard W. Hunter speaking. When he was president, he was president of the church for only a few months, but he put in a tape of him speaking, and I had in that classroom just, again, like pure intelligence for me, witness of the Holy Ghost, that this man was a prophet of God, and so those were important experiences. But the one in the MTC, so it did post-date those. But it was by far the most powerful of any of those, probably the most powerful spiritual experience I've had in my life. And when you say, what's the meaning of that? For me, it is the absolute core, the bedrock of my relationship with Jesus Christ. So at the core of everything else, I'm a follower of Jesus. And I really believe that he is who he said he was. There's a lot of study that's gone into that, a lot of thinking that's gone into that since then. But at the heart of that conviction is this experience.
So you would have walked away believing what about God?
That Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and he's my Savior, and he's the Savior of the world.
Would you have left those experiences having conclusions about the church's truthfulness and the Book of Mormon and all that?
Nope, separate. I mean, it was within that framework, right? It was while I was at the MTC or while I was at a BYU, in a BYU religion class, that this happened. So the church was a kind of framework, a structure through which those experiences and those witnesses could come. But even at the time, they were distinguished. But for me, it was never like the package deal. Like, I know that Jesus is the Christ, therefore Joseph Smith is a prophet, therefore the church is true, therefore, and sort of go down the line. And maybe it's just the way my brain works. I'm, in terms of, I've always been pretty analytical, and so I've tried to be pretty careful in my thinking. So for me, it was like, this is a witness that this man is a prophet of God, right? The President Hunter is a prophet of God. And I think even in that moment, it's like that there are prophets on the earth, right? So kind of the next Russian nesting doll out from that. But the testimony of Jesus, it was like, Jesus is the Christ. It wasn't about anything else. It was like, this is a testimony of Jesus.
I was just curious. So for you, in your brain, you didn't connect at all the idea of your membership or certain behaviors like praying and studying the scriptures and you didn't connect that actually allowed for you to have access to that experience?
I'll bet at the time I did. And certainly the experience with Jesus Christ, with my testimony of him, I was in prayer when I did that. So certainly that was the means by which that happened. The testimony of President Hunter, that happened. I was just sitting passively in a classroom, in a BYU. So I think so now, especially, it's really hard for me to reconstruct my state of mind a quarter century ago. Mm-hmm. Now I believe those simply as an act of grace, an act of will in the sense of putting myself in a place where I could be open to spiritual manifestations, but not that I earned it or like called it down from heaven or like I put the coin in the right slot,
Or did the right sequence of the list of things that you need to do to
So at the time I might have felt that, but even at the time, I knew like that testimony of President Hunter, like that came out of nowhere. I wasn't praying if I remember right, it was like an 8 a.m. class. Like I missed it a fair amount because I was a freshman in college. Like I was just there sitting passively and it just happened. Mm-hmm. So again, now I just understand that as like an act of pure grace. Certainly I was seeking the testimony of Jesus because I was coming out of that fireside. I was a missionary. I was about to go out, right? Like I've got to testify of these things. I've got to know these things. So there was a sense that like I'm going to pray and seek. But I'd said hundreds, thousands of prayers before that and never had an experience. So I had like no concept that I was going to have an experience like that. There was no sense of like I'm going to stay here until like an angel shows up or something like that. It was a very sincere prayer, but I'd given lots of sincere prayers before that. So now, for me, it's just pure grace.
I had a quick question with regard to high school. It could even be college too. This idea, like you've talked about, religion in your bones and kind of it feeling really natural for you, having a group of friends and, having this sort of structured support for your kind of belief and experience and it just fitting, right? You're saying it fit really well. Was there anything in your experience in high school? I'm thinking about my children in Logan, which I think is, a pretty insular community, largely Mormon, where we were. Compared to my high school experience. Was there anything outside your experience? So like people in high school, maybe a gay classmate, maybe that penetrated for you in any way around, this works for me, but I can see it be hard. Or even noticing for your mom, this idea that like, wow, mom's life looks hard. Like for her to have all this happen? Or did you have this sense of like, wow, it works really well for me, but did anything penetrate into your feeling box for others of like, but it may be different for other people?
Unfortunately, I don't think I did have that kind of sympathy for my mom at the time. I think it was just like, that's what moms do, right? So now I look back and I mean, just heroic, and she was also fitting into lots of scripts that were given to her, but at the time, unfortunately, that just didn't register for me. But I did in high school, junior high and high school, had a number of friends. They weren't like in my closest inner circle of friends, but a number of friends and classmates who were not LDS. There were several who were Jewish. One of my best friends was Catholic. I think his parents were like, and at the time I didn't even know what that meant really, other than the fact that they weren't Mormon. Like, and we never talked about religion. So I honestly don't even know. Did he go to mass? Like, I don't know, maybe. There were a small handful of kids who were Jewish, like just culturally, or did they go to synagogue? Like it wasn't really even on my radar task, but it was definitely like they were in all the honors and AP classes with me and stuff. So I respected them. I liked them. I knew that they weren't Mormon, and like I would have had enough of a kind of evangelistic sensibility about me to want them to be Mormon, right? To wish that they were Mormon, but not enough that like I think I can say with certainty, like I never gave a Book of Mormon to anybody in my life before I went on my mission, right? I don't think I would, even this really close friend of mine, Sean, this Catholic friend, I'm pretty sure I sent him a Book of Mormon when I was a missionary.
Yeah, I did that.
But I can't imagine that I did when I was in high school. Maybe invited them to seminary or to church, but it would have been like so it was like there were these friends of mine who I respected and loved, and were great people who were not Mormon. So like that was enough like to see like, oh, there are other paths, there are other ways of being human. And that was good for me. I wish I would have had more of that actually, but it was just a very deeply Mormon world that I lived in.
Okay, so where'd you go on your mission? Where'd you say? Seattle?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think I was there right before you. So I was in Seattle 95 to 97. When did you guys move up there?
Yeah, around 97, 98.
Yeah, so it would just because I ended my mission in Redmond in 97.
Yeah.
So who knows? We might have even barely overlapped there or something like that. Yeah.
Anything, normally we talk about missions, but since we're pressed for time a little bit, anything about your mission you want to share? Or just you want to frame it or characterize what it meant to you?
I had a great mission, and I learned a lot on my mission. I learned a lot about myself, and I was a very serious missionary, very obedient. If I have regrets about my mission, it's for being too self-righteous, especially towards my companions. And I write about this a little bit in some of my books. I really regret it, actually. I wish I would have been different, but I took it really seriously and I worked really hard, and and we didn't baptize a ton of people. I baptized some, but I had really good experiences, and I think I was deeply shaped in the long run most by a couple of things. One is that I really poured myself into scripture study on my mission. I took that time really seriously and just immersed myself in the scriptures, especially in the Book of Mormon and New Testament. So really came to know God through those books. And then I came, especially I think in the second half of my mission, I got to the point where like, and this annoyed some of my companions who were even more hardcore than I was. I was just really interested in talking with people. I actually, even by the end of my mission, I still liked tracting because, and we never had, I never baptized a single person off of knocking on doors, but I had great conversations. I met a lot of really interesting people. And especially in the second half of my mission, I was just as interested in hearing their stories about God and their spiritual lives as I was in sharing anything that I had to share. And again, that frustrated one companion in particular. He was the like challenge him to baptism on the doorstep type guy. And I was like hey, let's have a conversation about God type guy. And so we clashed a little bit. And when I told my mission president about this, great guy, Merrill Oaks, my second mission president, President Oaks' brother.
Oh, okay,
brother. And I told him, that we were just clashing totally different styles. And he just started laughing. He said, I knew that was going to happen when I put the two of you together. I knew you'd be good for each other. And we were. And so I really loved talking to people, learning from them. Again, it's just this religious gene in me. Like I'm interested in other people's experiences with God. And if I have something to share that can help you in your journey, great. But I wasn't shoving much down anybody's throat, especially by the second year, except again, maybe some of my companions.
Was Ed Decker doing his stuff in Seattle?
He was. So he was up in Issaquah doing his thing. So I never served in that area, but he was sort of legendary at the time. So yeah, the Godmakers was making the rounds at all the evangelical churches. So that's actually where I encountered evangelicalism, was on my mission. And that was really important. So, and I was the weird missionary who loved getting the anti-Mormon pamphlets. I collected them and read them and studied them. And actually it was evangelicals on my mission who taught me about grace. They were the ones who taught me to discover grace in the gospel, and so I'm grateful to them for those conversations. So I never served in the area where Ed lived. He was sort of legendary for always inviting the missionaries into his home, and like giving them drinks and feeding them and stuff, and because apparently, as it got back to me, I mean, this is second or third hand. Like his philosophy was like, it's better off that they're in my home than out knocking doors, right? Converting other people to Mormonism. So Seattle was a really weird place. There was this very strong evangelical influence with a very strong anti-Mormon tinge to it, but it's also King County, Washington, was then and remains one of the most secular places in the country. In terms of low rates of religious affiliation and stuff like that. So that was my first exposure to real diversity, to real poverty, to all those kinds of experiences, and that stuck with me. And I learned to work hard, and I learned to talk to people and be with people who are really different than me, and learn to love people who are different than me. So I look back at my dad always said that he thought about his mission every day of his life. That's not true for me. I actually don't think about it like consciously. I don't think about it all that much, but it taught me a lot of really important lessons.
Total shot in the dark. Was Mark Driscoll or Mars Hill doing their thing while you were on your mission? Does that even ring a bell?
Yeah, it rings a bell now. I don't know. They weren't on my radar then. Okay. So I don't know if it was a little early or if it wasn't in the right areas or whatever. Yeah, but I know who they are now. Yeah, for sure.
So talk about. I didn't hear much about in high school years you being confronted with quote anti-Mormon literature. So what was that like for you to encounter critiques of the LDS Church on your mission? Were there things that stuck out for you? Were there things that troubled you? Did you just kind of dismiss it? Did you read apologetic stuff and just buy that all hook, line, and sinker? Like, how did you deal with the anti-Mormon literature that you were exposed to?
Yeah, so I didn't reject it. I didn't keep it at arm's length. Like I said, I actually collected these pamphlets and read them, and I did read them, and I took them seriously, and I would have long conversations. And I was, especially in the first half of my mission, I spent a lot of time arguing with evangelicals. The second half of my mission, I didn't just, I was more interested in just having good conversations. Yeah. So the tone shifted. But and I had something of a reputation of like being good at, we called it Bible bashing, right? Mm-hmm. And I was good at it, as good as a 19-year-old, mm-hmm. right? It's going to be like, these people I was talking to, especially like the ministers, they knew way more than me, but I thought I was hot stuff. Mm-hmm. So, but I read it. Some of it, I was put off by what I sensed as a kind of mean-spiritedness of some of it. So it just wasn't inviting to me or welcoming to me because it was just mean. Yeah. But some of it, and I remember I talk about this in my book Planted. I remember distinctly having a conversation with a guy about Joseph Smith as a money digger, and I remember bearing testimony to him, like, I know that Joseph Smith was not a money digger, right? I didn't know. I didn't know what I was talking about. But I just had this kind of fervency that bore my testimony of that. And then, of course, I go home and read a thing or two. And I was like, oh, well, actually, after all. So I think I mostly responded. At no point did they cause a kind of crack in my testimony. They raised questions for me that persisted and stayed with me, and that I took home to BYU. And then when I did start to read and study, so they introduced new frameworks and questions for me, but they didn't shake me as a missionary. If anything, probably led me to retrench.
Okay. Anything else you want to share about your mission?
No, just other than I'm sorry for all the people that I was obnoxious to.
Can I have a couple follow-ups on the mission? Yeah. I was really curious. So when you kind of place yourself back into the fervent mode, yeah, with being hard on companions, yeah. I think that you were kind of saying that. Do you remember, because I think the driver or behind that can be really different for different people. Do you remember what you were thinking in those moments where, I don't know what that was showing up like behaviorally toward them, but if it was like judgment or if it was like
a lot of judgment.
Do you remember what was going on inside you as far as like the drive to act that way?
Yeah, I mean, I just for me it was about being as obedient as I could, and I think at the time I would have believed that the more obedient I am, the more God will bless me, and the more, which would look like bringing more people into the church, right? Mm-hmm. So if I don't do everything that I can do, and if my companion can't do everything that he can do, and if our district doesn't do everything that they can do, like there are going to be souls out there that we don't get to.
Got it.
Right? They're, like we will not do what God called us to do. So I've never had a relationship with God where I felt like he was going to be like a really angry, disappointed, like harsh judge of me. It was more that like there's work to be done here. There's blessings to be had, and I won't get them unless I'm like given 100%, and the people around me are given 100% too.
Got it. So strong sense, it sounds, of like responsibility.
Yeah, and obedience brings blessings. Obedience is the first law of heaven.
That's right. And then dependent. Now you're dependent with, you're working with other people.
That's right. So it's not
just
me.
You're like, hey, come on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So companion sleeping in was a big, that was a travesty, right? Because and I had some companion. I mean, one companion who was smoking the whole time. He was my companion and stuff. So like weird stuff happens on missions. But it was this sense that like, again, not that I really don't think I've ever had the relationship where God was the angry God hanging me over the pit of hell, right? It was just like this is like serious, right? There are souls on the line here. There's people, and if we are not doing everything that we can do, somebody, somewhere, someone is going to be lost, and that's a heavy burden.
Maximize.
Absolutely.
And then just really quick, also, you described a shift in your mission, where I think you said the first kind of part where you were much more talking a lot and trying to, and then the latter half, I think you mentioned just really being more interested in people's stories, right? And listening. And do you remember how that shift came about? Was it just super organic? Was it more exposure and you just genuinely enjoyed it? Like that curiosity. And then how did you receive those stories? Was it like, well, they're not Mormon, so, I mean, that's their experience, but it's a little, you know what I mean? Less, like how did you perceive that part of it?
Yeah. The transition itself was pretty organic and gradual. There wasn't like a clean break or a shift or a moment. I think I would chalk it up to just greater maturity. And I think also, I think the gospel kind of soaking into my heart, my learning to be a little more humble and loving, less judgmental. But yeah, in terms of listening to other people's stories, no doubt. I mean, at no point did I relinquish the idea that like these people should be Mormon, like they'd be better off Mormon, and that my job here ultimately, like the best possible outcome here is for them to accept the gospel and get baptized. But I was also genuinely okay with walking away if they didn't. Because I think part of this maturity and learning, maybe it was learning about grace from evangelicals, but also like really believing in the plan of salvation. Like at no point, like I never bought the whole idea like people have one chance if they say no to missionaries, like that's their chance, and like they said no, right? I never bought into that. So like I always had this sense like, like life is long, eternity is long, right? Like I'm here, like it just wasn't the right time. And so we'll have a conversation. If it goes somewhere, great. If not, we'll go and talk to the next person. So definitely like I was not a thoroughgoing, maybe getting close to pluralism, certainly not a relativist, not even close. But willing to let God do his work in his own time.
Okay.
All right. Well, there's 3 post-mission strains I want to follow, maybe in sequence. One is your courtship with your now wife. I want to hear about that.
Yeah.
I want to hear about the progression of your academic career and also the progression of your faith.
Yeah.
And I imagine those things are all happening in parallel, developing in parallel.
Yeah.
So let's start with, is it okay to start with your wife, or would you rather start with?
Of course, we can talk about her all day.
Okay.
Yeah. So my wife, Melissa, so I graduated from BYU without getting married. At the time, that was a really heavy burden for me. Deeply wanted to be married and really tried. I dated a lot and did have girlfriends at BYU. It just didn't work out. So I graduated and went to Notre Dame for graduate school. They have a great program in American religious history. I knew that's what I wanted to do. But it was funny when I called my mom and told her that I'd gotten into Notre Dame. Literally, the first words out of her mouth were not "Congratulations, I'm proud of you." It's like, "How are you ever going to meet a Mormon girl at Notre Dame?" Right? So, which I did eventually. So God works in mysterious ways. So I went out to Notre Dame, and it was my I was in my fourth year there, third or fourth year. That I still remember it. I was sitting on the stand. I was giving a talk in church that day. Let's just say there were not a lot of single LDS women at Notre Dame. That may be a surprise. But I was sitting on the stand, and all of a sudden, this really cute redheaded girl walked in the back door, and I hadn't seen her before. I was like, the radar went off pretty immediately. And so she was, I was in grad school there. She was an undergraduate there. She went there as a good Catholic girl. She grew up in South Texas, Hispanic Catholic family. Her mom was a teacher at a Catholic school, later on became principal of the Catholic school. And so Melissa had grown up a Catholic and went to Notre Dame. It was a big deal for this Southern Texas Hispanic family to send their daughter to Notre Dame. And her freshman year, Notre Dame's just an incredible spiritual place. I mean, every dorm has a chapel in it with an assigned priest. There's mass, and obviously kids are all over the map in terms of how serious they take it. But it's a spiritual place. It's suffused with spirituality, and so she was on a kind of spiritual journey her freshman year, but just was not connecting with her own Catholicism. Despite really trying, going to lots of mass with friends and so forth. So she went home after that freshman year and spent the summer searching, reading about all kinds of religions, really searching, like taking it really, that's what basically did like a comparative religion course over that summer on her own. And she was increasingly frustrated. And she tells this story about how one night she knelt by her bedside. It's funny when she tells it, she said, God, give me a sign. She says, I was Catholic. I believe in signs, right? And she said, God, like, if you're real, if you're there, like, you got to let me know, like, I'm getting tired of looking and not finding anything. And so if you're there, you got to let me know. If not, fine, I'll just move on with my life. She goes to bed. She wakes up in the morning with the door knocking, and it's two Mormon missionaries. And she sends them away. But actually, she had good friends in high school. Some of her closest friends were Mormon. And so later on that day, actually, it sort of occurred to her, she was with these girlfriends of hers, it kind of occurred to her, she's like, oh, wait a minute, like, I need to talk to your missionaries. And they're like, what? They had been hoping and praying for this for years. And so she had the discussions that summer. Her mom was not happy about it, would not allow the missionaries into the home. So she took the discussions at her friend's home, decided she wanted to be baptized, but her parents asked her to wait to show that she was serious about it. And so that's when I met her. So it was the beginning of her sophomore year. She walks into church because she wants to be a member of the church, but not yet baptized. And so we just get to be friends at first. And then she goes home over Christmas, gets baptized. As soon as she comes back, we start dating, and we dated for a couple years before getting married. Yeah, so we met at church, but I had nothing to do with her conversion process. And I actually think that was helpful in terms of her family. They still weren't thrilled about the whole Mormon thing, especially her mom. But the fact that I was not the agent of that. I was just like the pick me up along the way, that helped. And then the big conflict for us at the time was whether to get married in the temple. She was a new convert. Obviously that was my expectation growing up. And we prayed about it, we thought about it, we talked about it, we counseled with our bishop, who was one of our close friends, just an amazing guy. And we came to the conclusion that no, we shouldn't. That we don't want to start our family by alienating hers. And that broke my mom's heart. I still remember her crying when we broke the news to her that we wouldn't be married in the temple right away. And so we did. We actually had a great wedding on the beach in South Texas. Our bishop,
like Padre Island or Corpus Christi,
South Padre Island,
okay,
yeah. So our bishop, who had counseled us through this whole thing, he flew down. So he's the one who married us.
Oh, wow!
On this beach, and we had this great party. Big Mexican wedding. They pulled out the alcohol after we left. I mean, it was all this like negotiation with her family, like what parts of it, like it's going to be a Mormon wedding, but not a totally Mormon wedding. There'll be alcohol, but but not all night, And so like we just negotiated this like Mormon Catholic wedding, right?
Oh, cool story.
And then we got sealed exactly on our 1 year anniversary. One year, now you can do it sooner, but we got sealed on our 1 year anniversary. So that all worked out. But we're really grateful that we did that. And I think that everybody's situation is different, but for us, that was the right thing to do.
Wow. That's super cool.
Yeah. So she's amazing. Yeah. So we've been married for 17 years now.
And congratulations.
Thanks.
And how many kids?
4 kids.
4 kids?
Yep.
Okay.
And what do you remember about Melissa? What do you remember, being notable about her?
Yeah, she's brilliant. Just very deeply smart, curious. She is fun. She has like the best laugh in the world. She just has a personality that is just contagious. She's not necessarily like life of the party. I think she would describe herself as an introvert. I think that would surprise a lot of people because she is so friendly. But she's just also a really thoughtful person. Cares a lot about the world, cares about people. I was attracted really, she's beautiful too, so I was physically attracted to her right off the bat. But she's just a deeply good person who cares a lot about people. So immediately after graduating, her first job was working as the family and children's coordinator in the homeless center there in South Bend. She's just this past week, started a master's program in social work up at Utah State. Like that's who she is at her core. She's just like a deeply good person, but who's just like off the charts, brilliant, creative. She's an award-winning, literally like nationally renowned quilt artist. She has pieces in museums and traveling shows and stuff like that. So she's always been creative. So, she's just she's a phenomenal human being. And some of that stuff was down the road, right? But like that was all in her,
right?
When I met her.
Yeah.
All right. I love it. I hope to meet Melissa someday.
Yeah. She's great. She's very passionate.
Hey,
she's passionate about
when
things.
I came at you a little bit, she came at me. That was, and I respected that. She's like, what are you doing ripping on my husband? You know what I mean?
No, she's very, and she'll say that's the Latina in her.
She's like,
right?
what the heck, John? Like, cut Patrick some slack. I'm like, go Melissa, yeah.
Well, I still remember that night. Sometimes we have different personalities. We handle conflict differently. Yeah. She's fiercely loyal. Yeah. She will fight. You were on one side of that, but she'll fight for the people that she cares about and the things that she loves.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to just delve in because I think how couples handle conflict is actually a really interesting. And you had so part of your story I remember was, I recognize now in retrospect maybe my parents were having some under rumblings where it was hard, and I didn't really know. I didn't perceive it at the time. Yeah. So that's kind of a conflict, a little slice of how you and then
conflict avoidance, right?
Right. Yep. Of a way of experiencing a conflict style in your own home. So how would you describe kind of your conflict differences coming into marriage, and what have you created now? Yeah,
that's such an important question. And I've thought about this a lot, especially on the academic side. All this stuff with peace studies and conflict resolution and so forth. So definitely I came from a conflict avoidance background. And so that's my sort of natural approach. I don't like conflict. I don't, it doesn't give me any energy. It actually, it takes a lot out of me. Melissa is a little bit more of a fighter, and she grew up in a great family, just amazing parents, great family, but I think they were just more open emotionally and a little bit more open conflict and just more comfortable doing that. And it didn't mean you didn't love each other, right? And so she brought two different conflict styles coming into our marriage, and I think we're still working on it. We've become we're great friends. But we're still working on our communication. I think still the tendencies that we brought into our marriage are still both of our default positions. Again, I've learned a lot of tools academically that I try to implement. So what I'd like to be is more of a kind of conflict transformation person, a person who kind of leans into conflict and is able to transform it into something constructive.
Yeah.
I'm still learning how to actually do that. I know how it works intellectually. It's harder to do personally. She also, again, her default is to fight a little bit, but I think I've smoothed some of those edges off, and so it's not perfect by any stretch, but I think we've both we've learned from each other, and we're still growing together.
Yeah. I think awareness is such a key piece. Without awareness, there's nowhere to go. So I love this idea of like, well, I know how I naturally show up in conflict and what it feels like to me. And then I hear kind of you're trying some new things in there. Yeah. And then also it sounds like influence, like you kind of influence each other. Totally. As well.
Totally. And so I have to, it's a willful act. So when I see her respond in a way that, so more forcefully, that would naturally I'd want to avoid or
run.
So it then becomes an act of will for me to recognize where she's coming from. It's not an act of aggression, on her part. It's just part of her communication and conflict style. So it takes me a minute, to recognize that and say, okay, then how do I respond? And she's talked about the same thing, right? I mean, that she'll recognize some of the ways that I approach things, and that she's more emotional. I'm a little more analytical, right? And so then she has to recognize like the space that I'm coming from and what I'm trying to, and so. As you said, the awareness part of it, both the self-awareness, but then the other awareness, right? And to do it within a relationship of love and trust. And again, 17 years, we're not perfect, but we're better than we were 17 years ago.
I love that. That is real life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, let's talk about now let's rewind back to your mission.
Yeah.
How do you get into Mormon studies, to history? Just talk about kind of your career path from mission to now.
So I've always loved history. Like I knew I declared myself a history major from day one when I entered BYU.
Mostly American was your...
I was always mostly interested in American history. One of my great character defaults is I don't speak any other languages. I love traveling internationally and so forth. I barely speak English, and so American history was going to be it for me. But I've always loved American history, going way back to elementary school, and so history was natural. The religious history was not necessarily inevitable, but I was pretty sure, like I said, by the time I graduated from BYU, that I wanted to do religious history, and that's why I chose Notre Dame and went there.
Religious history.
Specifically, so the history of religion in the United States. So not theology, but like the history of religion. And so actually, if you would have asked me during my first 2 or 3 years of grad school, like what my specialty was going to be, it would have been African-American religion. So it was not Mormonism. I was studying Mormonism totally on the side, like a little bit here or there, but not a deep dive into it at all. My deep dive was into African-American religions. And so that I wrote papers on that, gave conference papers, to have publications in that area. So that was sort of my first.
So going back to your time at BYU, You arrived a couple of years after the September 6th crackdown had happened. Student review, I don't even know if that was still around when you were at BYU.
Yeah.
I left BYU. Margie and I both left BYU in 93.
Okay.
So we don't know what it was like after we left. We just know we went to Joanna Brooks there while we were there. Student review, September 6th. There was the whole Cecilia Farr.
Gail Houston.
Gail Houston, David Knowlton. All that happened while I was there. I'm wondering, in terms of Mormon studies, controversies, truth claim stuff, what did you experience? What do you remember experiencing while you were at BYU?
Yeah,
if anything?
That's actually a great question. It's a really important question, and there's a kind of serendipity for me being just young enough to miss all that stuff. And the serendipity is that I didn't know how controversial all this stuff was. And it didn't affect me. I didn't witness it. I wasn't in those circles. It didn't affect me. So when I did become interested, when my academic interest in Mormonism started, I didn't know it was dangerous. I was so naive. I was just well, who wouldn't be interested in this stuff? So so my first academic exposure to Mormonism did happen at BYU. Happened under the tutelage of David Whitaker, who was the longtime special collections curator in the library for the Mormon materials there. And so he taught a course in the history department about Mormonism, not in religious ed. It was Mormon history from an academic perspective, and David taught this, and that was my first exposure to Mormon history, Mormon studies, any of this in an academic sense. And it was phenomenal. And David taught it straight up. That's where I learned about Joseph Smith and folk magic. So again, that's where 2 years earlier, I'm like, he never did it. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. He did, right? This is where I learned about the priesthood temple ban, where I learned about polygamy, where I learned about Mountain Meadows massacre, where I learned about, Mormon Native American relations, correlation. I mean, it was it was straight up Mormon history.
This is a course?
It was a course, in the history department. I think it's still offered today.
Just like Mormon controversies?
It was Mormon history.
Oh, okay.
It was Mormon history. But not from a religious ed point of view. It wasn't faith. It was we are here as historians to study the Mormon past.
So you would have learned about Leonard Arrington and all that?
I think on day one. The first lecture was the doing of Mormon history. So I'd never heard of Leonard Arrington in my life. So David Whitaker is the one who taught me all of this stuff. He was my first exposure.
Wow.
That was when I read The Mormon Experience, Arrington and Bitten's book. It's the first time I'd read any of this stuff. The first time I dove into the primary sources in a serious way, right?
Would he have talked about Fawn Brody? Would he have talked about
absolutely.
the September 6th?
100%. Yep.
Because Michael Quinn would have left the history department
just barely,
just a few years prior.
I would have taken that class after my mission. So this would have been in 97 or 98 that I was taking his class.
Wow.
So, but again, as a kid, you're 5 years ago, that's ancient history, right? It wasn't ancient. It was fresh and it was raw, but not for me. I still have my notes from that class. We talked about everything, and it was straight up. And I ended up working for David in special collections, helped process the Thomas Kane collection down there, and we would talk about stuff. I went on a study abroad with him. He was the director of the London study abroad, so I went. And so David was my first mentor in Mormon history, and I got it at BYU, and it was important for me because we talked about all this stuff in a BYU classroom, unflinchingly, and I knew that David went to church, and I was okay, it's not scary to talk about this stuff. Again, I didn't know that it was supposed to be scary. Nobody ever told me that it was supposed to be scary to do all this. Really, it sounds strange today, but I remember, and I know that my other roommates weren't all that interested in it. And I knew what I was studying there wasn't what we were doing at church. It was very clear. This is the academic study of this stuff, and then there's what you do at church. So there was a division there. But I didn't know that it got people in trouble. David told me that it did. We learned about the September 6th and so forth, but it just seemed it was like, no problem. And it's total serendipity. If I was 2 years older, right, I would have been at BYU during the September 6th, and I think I'd have a very different experience. But for me, there was this kind of distance. And so when I finally, started to get into when I started to pursue it more seriously, in grad school, I wrote a paper here because actually my professors were really interested that I was Mormon. It was mostly Catholic and evangelical students in my cohort. So came to learn a lot and love a lot about those traditions. But my professor, I had one professor in particular, he was a former Catholic priest. He'd always say, he was this kind of like gruff old guy. And he'd say like, what's the Mormon take on that? And I was like, there is no Mormon take on like the Puritans or something like that. But he always wanted to know like, what's the Mormon take on that? So me and one other guy, we were admitted into the program. We were really like the token Mormons. I think it was kind of an experiment. Because one of my professors there, his name was George Marsden, a huge figure in evangelical scholarship. And he had just written a book called The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. And his argument in there was like, hey, we're doing this postmodern thing. Like everybody's bringing their perspectives to the table, like black perspectives and feminist perspectives. And it was a little early for queer perspectives. But he said, if everybody's bringing their perspectives to the table, why can't religious people do the same? And so he had this kind of project of like religious people being part of the academy, and certainly you got to learn the rules of the game. You got to do academic scholarship, but why can't religious people be here too? And so, he was bringing in evangelical students. Obviously, Notre Dame was attracting Catholic students, and so my friend Mike DeGruccio and I'm sure we were the Mormon experiment. Is like, how far can we push this? Like, and so we were these two Mormon kids who were admitted into the history program. And so I wrote on Mormonism every once in a while. It really wasn't until my dissertation that I did it in any kind of serious way.
Let me go back and ask you just a clarifying question. So first of all, this course, I wish it were available right now to the public because I had to learn all this stuff in my 30s.
I teach this course at USU right now.
What's it?
It's called Mormonism and the American Religious Experience. I teach it every year, and I have a colleague. So I have a colleague who teaches it every fall. I teach it every spring.
There needs to be like how like I did opencourseware for MIT. There needs to be an OpenCourseWare course where you share your lectures and the reading materials for the world. Because like I would love every Mormon. I talk about informed consent a lot. We'll get to that later. But like everyone should know the intellectual history of Mormonism as just a matter of basic informed consent.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Yeah. I mean, I would pay you to do a podcast on that, but we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so I want to understand. So you take this course and you would have learned about B.H. Roberts, I'm sure. Yep. You have learned about Juanita Brooks and Fawn Brody, Lowell Bennion, Leonard Arrington, Eugene
that whole
England.
Intellectual tradition. Yep.
And are you saying you finished that course not knowing how super polarizing and dangerous and controversial Mormon studies was?
I knew it intellectually.
Not emotionally.
Not emotionally.
Not experientially.
Exactly.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. That's a good clarification.
Okay.
Yeah. No, and David made abundantly clear, like, this was not easy for these people, right? And there were consequences. They paid the price for their intellectual scholarship and for, they made great sacrifice. So that was abundantly clear. I just hadn't felt it or experienced it. I think I was, President Hinckley was president of the church. I think my feeling, my sense, and I don't think I was alone, it was like, that's in the past, right? It's like, it's a new day. Right? It's President Hinckley, it's like a new spirit, and so, we've learned from that. And so I think I had this kind of optimism, maybe naive optimism, that they had paid the price, and that now it was a new day.
Okay. So just me geeking out a tiny bit.
Yeah.
Were there any characters in, humans, figures in that course that really that struck a chord with you emotionally, where you're like, you really felt like you felt for their experience or emotionally connected with them, maybe even in a tragic or a sympathetic way? What characters stood out for you? Yeah,
for me, it was the whole experience of race, Mormonism's travail with race. So we spent a lot of time, David was also a Western historian, so we spent a lot of time on Mormons and Native Americans. So really wrestled with that experience all the way up to George P. Lee and some of those difficult stories. But what really, I'm an American historian. I've always been interested in Mormonism, or in America's wrestle with race. And so the African American story really resonated with me. So I wrote my. We spent a lot of time on it in that class. It was the first time that we really dove into the details about the priesthood temple ban. Talked about, we read a lot of those difficult racist statements from church leaders. Talked about the history. I ended up writing my senior thesis at BYU about the history of anti-miscegenation laws in Utah, laws against interracial marriage. And that got published in the Utah Historical Quarterly, and the religious influence in that. So I've always been, those stories really resonated with me. And I had another really profound experience at about this same time. Is while I was a study abroad student in London, Eugene England, so as I said, David Whitaker was leading our study abroad, but Eugene England was there leading the theater study abroad, so a parallel program at the same time. And I'd never met Eugene England before. I only knew him from what I'd heard about in class. And he put on a fireside one night for Black members of the church there to talk about their experiences. And I just went because I was just curious. And it was one of the most transformative meetings I've ever been in. Eugene England was just so open and loving and honest. And made clear that this was a place where people could share their stories. And then he just my memory is he just turned it over to these Black, so it wasn't him talking at them. It was like creating a space like, okay, let's hear your experiences. And these, this was in England, so these were mostly Black British, Africans, who were living in England, and they talked about, some of them had heard about it before they got baptized. Some didn't know about the ban until after they were baptized. All of them talked about having wrestled with this, some of the experiences they had as members of the church, experiencing racism in the church. I just remember, and I still have a journal entry where I talk about this. I mean, just being so deeply moved in every which way. I was inspired by their faith. I was inspired by their courage and their bravery and their fortitude. I was deeply saddened. I mean, I remember, shedding tears, hearing their stories, hearing them talk about their pain. So that, all of that was happening. And again, when I went to grad school, I studied African-American religious history. So that experience, the kind of American experience with race, the way that infected Mormonism, if there's one aspect of it that really resonated with me, it was the journey with race.
Okay. Have you met Lester Bush? I'm just curious.
I've never met, in passing, in passing. Yeah.
Would you have learned about Darius Gray and the Genesis group at that?
So I read Lester Bush's essay in that class.
Right.
And then I don't remember when I first met Darius. We've met several times. We've been, done lots of things since. He's one of my heroes.
Yeah.
And all those folks. And I've just recently been reading some of Matt Harris's scholarship and really tough stuff. But those are some of my spiritual heroes.
Beautiful. What about deep thinking around the church's truth claims and the veracity of the church's truth claims while you were a BYU student?
Yeah.
And sister companion to that, did you have any inklings of faith struggles or cracks in your testimony? Once, if you did start at that point considering issues of the church's veracity.
Yeah, so that is, as I said, it goes back to my mission, all these anti-Mormon pamphlets that I got, right? Raising all these questions about Joseph Smith, about the Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, polygamy, of course, those kinds of things. So that was all now in my mental furniture that I took with me back to BYU. And the fact that I really credit taking that class and doing it under the tutelage of David Whitaker and having conversations with him. Like the fact that I could come back, and then we talked about all of that stuff that I read about in these pamphlets that were criticizing the church. Then I came back, and in a BYU classroom, we talked about all that stuff in a way that was honest, where we read the primary sources. We were reading the scholarship. I was like that gave me a kind of confidence that these weren't things that you just had to shove aside, like bury under the rug. It was like, okay, I can read, it was a one semester class. So we couldn't talk about everything, but the fact that we talked about every single one of those things that I'd read about, every single one of those criticisms came up in that class in a forthright way. I was like, okay. So that gave me then the confidence that propelled me into then in my own studies, then, just in my own private time, like most people do. This is all before you come along, before, most of this stuff is on the internet. So I'm still reading most of this stuff in books and in dialogue and stuff like this. But it was that class and that experience at BYU that gave me the confidence to do it. And so I didn't. I just genuinely have not had like the big faith crisis. I have tons of questions, tons of things.
Still.
Of course, I have lots of things that are unresolved.
No, but you still have never had a faith crisis.
Never earth-shaking, rattling one.
Yeah, I've met people like that.
Yeah. I just haven't.
Yeah.
And I've had every opportunity to. And I just haven't.
Right.
And again, that's a grace. I didn't earn that. I'm no better or worse than anybody else. It's just me.
Maybe a little bit of privilege.
So no doubt,
yeah,
right? But there are a lot of people whose life stories are roughly parallel to mine who have, right?
Yeah.
And So again, like
that fitting you so well. Like the fact too, right? That original fitting.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, here's what I'll say. Like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as it exists today, it was made for and by and of people like me.
Meaning white, straight, heterosexual, cisgender.
Naturally religious.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. So the church was made for and by and for people like me. It's not an irony. It's not lost on me. Now, there are lots of other people who also check all my boxes for whom it doesn't become comfortable, right? And I have reasons where sometimes it rubs up and there's friction, partly because of my politics and my intellectual life and other kinds of things. So the clothes don't always perfectly fit, right? But the church was built by and for American straight, white, naturally religious guys.
Of Mormon background.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't originally. And converts have done pretty well, right? But it helps to be acculturated into it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I don't. Yeah. Even just thinking at kind of historically and sociologically, psychologically, there's no doubt that that's all part of the story.
Yeah, I think a really interesting piece for me is the fact of where your story I think contrasts so much to other people's stories in that you had this class where you're exploring and being exposed to, and then having this whole where you can talk about it, you can discuss it. And it's so curious, like, to think about if that hadn't existed, but you had the information, because your church experience.
Oh yeah, there was none of this happening at
right?
church.
Like probably a foil.
Yep.
Maybe to that,
or in your religion classes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I never had any like really bad experiences in my BYU religion classes. They ranged from mediocre to good. But no, absolutely, we weren't talking about any of this stuff, right? It was the fact that I was a history major who took this class at a certain time from a certain. It was like the stars lined up, right? Now, is that scalable? Is that replicable? Yeah, I think so. I think, as you said, I think if everybody had a class like this as a college student, I think it would strengthen people rather than weaken them. On the whole, right? Now, some people would take that. I'll bet there were people who took that. I know that there were people who took that class because, as I said, I worked for David. So I worked at a desk just outside his office. I saw fellow students from the class who went in and, had long conversations with him. So, so the inoculation model is not perfect. People who get booster shots still get sick, but it's. I think there's something to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Just the idea of silence and feeling alone and isolated.
Totally.
As opposed to.
And feeling betrayed and misled.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Well, and then there was that, and then
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Margie.
No, I like those additions. Those are important.
Yeah, and then in grad school, again, not a lot of Mormons at Notre Dame, but we had, again, just serendipitously or providentially, there was a group of Latter-day Saint students that are studying all kinds of stuff. As I said, I had one guy in my history cohort, but psychology and law and business and philosophy and political science. There was this handful of Latter-day Saint grad students at Notre Dame. And we got together on Friday and Saturday nights, and we talked about all this stuff. I mean, we talked about music and Notre Dame football. I mean, all kinds of stuff. But we like late into the night, 1, 2, 3 in the morning. We talked about it. We formed our own institute class because there was no institute at Notre Dame, so we created our own. And so we again, it's privilege and luck and serendipity and things just lining up. That I had structures and communities and relationships where I could talk about all of this stuff from age 21, to today, but really in those formative years in my 20s, around other people who were working it out, who wrestled. Not all those people have stayed in the church. Some have left. Some have. Everybody has different relationships to it. So, but we're all still really close. But it was, again, this sense that you can talk about all this stuff. We don't talk about it at church. And I have ideas about that, about whether that's, the good and bad parts of that. But I always had a flesh and blood community where I could talk about hard things.
Okay, wait, I have a quick question around this. So you had this experience studying at BYU. So when you met Melissa, and Melissa had, I'm just going to guess, basic level discussions. And then how did you bridge that gap? Does Melissa know all the things? Is that something that was important to you? How did you work that out in relationship to another human? Yeah,
I mean, I'm not her professor. I was her boyfriend and then her husband. But she, from right out of the gate, again, this community at Notre Dame of other grad students, she just started hanging out with us on Friday and Saturday nights. Once we got, we had fun dates too, right? And it was a little weird for her because she was a lot younger. She's 6 years younger than me and a lot younger than some of the others. But she became integrated in this community. So very early in her church life, she was in the mix too. And again, she's a highly intelligent person, who loves the contest of ideas. Talking about hard things doesn't scare her. It invigorates her. Different people are wired differently. But she had a powerful spiritual, she genuinely felt and feels that God had called her into this church. And so for her, I remember, this is really her story more than mine, but in one of our early conversations while we were dating, maybe we were engaged at this point, we were talking about polygamy. It was just the two of us. And she said at one point, I don't care all that much about Joseph Smith. And I was like, what? Right? Even still, I was like, because I knew of her commitment and I knew of her spiritual, experiences that are brought her into the church. And she said, that's not why I joined this church. That's not so she had this really, I think, healthy relationship to saying I don't have to own all that stuff. It's part of this church, that it's part of its history and so forth. But I think it also helped that she was Catholic, right? She's like, there's a lot of you know, she
Yeah,
knew
there
what it
was a
was.
past
She
to
knew what
that.
it was like to have authentic spirituality in a community and in a tradition with a really messy history, and she was able to divorce that in a way that that I think is foreign to a lot of Latter-day Saints. It was even to some degree still foreign to me at that time, and some people would say. Some people might even disagree with decoupling it, but for her, at least in her own experience, she said, like, I didn't join this church for Joseph Smith. And so there was a sense for her, like, I don't have to own all, like, that stuff isn't my stuff. Like, I came to this community for other reasons, and I have a different relationship to it. So yeah, so she was part of these conversations, like, really early in her church life, and processing it. And she still processes it slightly different than I do. We're different people with different experiences and different, but it was there from the beginning.
Yeah, thank you.
Love it. Okay, so so you didn't. I really relate to your experience because I was exposed through honors colloquium at BYU to Eugene England, Lowell Benyon, Leonard Arrington, Phil Barlow, the book A Thoughtful Faith. And so even though I had my faith crisis in the early 2000s at Microsoft, when I leave Microsoft in 2004 and then start Mormon Stories in 2005, I had this naive optimism. It's like, hey, all these super brilliant Harvard-educated academics, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich and Claudia and Richard Bushman.
Right.
It's like, hey, they all knew, they all knew and know more than I'll ever know.
Yep.
And they still believe. So, like, we just got to talk about it.
So what's the problem?
We'll solve the problem, right?
Right.
So that's how we started Mormon Stories in 2005. It's just like, if we just talk about this, get it out in the open, people won't feel alone. We'll talk through it all. We'll make the church a big tent, and everything will be great.
Everybody lives happily ever after, right?
Happily ever after, right? So I relate to how you leave BYU feeling.
Yeah.
So really quickly, let's just then, you've kind of talked about, Melissa, and you've talked about the fact that you've never really had a dark night of the soul faith crisis. So let's just follow your academic career quickly and just tell us how it led you to ultimately sitting in the Leonard Arrington Chair of Mormon Studies.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and definitely we can talk about it. I mean, my faith life has changed for sure. It's evolved. It's not what it was when I was a 19-year-old missionary. But yeah, I just haven't had some of the same experiences that other people have, that many other people have had. So academically, and I won't bore people with this, I mean, it's very serendipitous that, so as again, I did not intend on studying Mormonism, Mormon history. When it came time for me to write a dissertation, I wrote my dissertation on violence against religious minorities in the South in the late 19th century. I was really interested. So the first Ku Klux Klan is just racist. The second, that's 1860s. The second Ku Klux Klan in the 19-teens and 20s adds Catholics and Jews to the list. I was like, how did that happen? Right? So I was interested in this period in between, like, how did religious minorities get thrown in the mix? I thought the dissertation, I thought the story was just going to be violence against Catholics and Jews. And I actually uncovered a lot about that. I've published on some of those things. But I threw in Mormons really as an afterthought because I didn't think there was much of a story there. Obviously, everybody knows about Missouri in the 1830s, right? You know, Nauvoo in the 1840s. And so I didn't think there was much of a story in the South in the late 19th century. Well, it turns out that there were more instances of anti-Mormon violence in the South during this period, 1870s and 80s, than there were against Catholics and Jews combined. Obviously, anti-Black violence is on a whole different scale, right? I mean, that's just, you know, that's part of the nightmare of American history. But all of a sudden, I had this treasure trove of data. And this was like hard won. This was going through newspapers like on microfilm. I mean, it was like old school history stuff, like really needle in a haystack type research in archives throughout the South. I literally spent one summer, I got a grant from the American Historical Association. I went from archive to archive in every southern state throughout the Deep South looking for this stuff and using the church archives, which were just kind of opening up, kind of early, you know, like of kind of the new era of opening up. But And so I had this dissertation, I had all this great stuff on anti-Mormon violence, and I had a decision to make when it came to turning the dissertation into the book. Do I talk about the whole story, including the Catholics and Jews, or do I really lean into the Mormon stuff, which is frankly my best data, it's the newest story and so forth. So I decided to pivot towards the Mormon material. That became my first book, published in 2011. And it was, again, complete serendipity or providence or something. But that was the year that Richard Bushman, they had just started the chair at Claremont Graduate University, the Howard W. Hunter Chair in Mormon
What year is
Studies,
this?
in 2008.
Oh, we're already in 2008?
We're already in 2008.
How long were you in freaking Notre Dame?
6 years.
Did you and I, were we at Notre Dame when I was working for MIT? Did we meet?
We met once. We met at least like in the lobby of the hotel at the Morris Inn. I remember meeting you there. I think that was the first time we ever met.
Were you single at that point still, or?
I may have been. Would have depended on the year. Well,
2000.
I almost definitely would have been, because I got married at about the time that I graduated. I got married in 2004. I got my PhD in 2005.
Okay.
So all that research is early 2000s. My first job, I stick around at Notre Dame in a couple of teaching positions. My first tenure track job is in Egypt.
You were saying something about Bushman, though. I'm sorry, I got you off track.
Yeah, so Bushman had... So the Howard W. Hunter Chair in Mormon Studies had started at Claremont Graduate University in 2008.
Okay.
Richard Bushman came out of retirement at Columbia University to take that position to basically shore it up, right? I mean, nobody has more prestige or gravitas as a Mormon historian other than Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, but she wasn't leaving Harvard for that. So Richard came out of retirement to do this with the understanding that he'd just be there for 3 years. So he and Claudia came out to Claremont for 3 years. So in 2011, when that job came up and when they really opened it up, again, I was only a couple years. I got my PhD in 2005, so this is only like 5 years later when they're posting the job. I had just published my first book. I was a young junior professor when this job came up. But again, part of the serendipity of this is that in Mormon studies, you had this well-established older generation, Bushman's generation, right? By then, all those people were too old to take that position. They were all near retirement age. It should have gone to somebody who was in their like 50s or something like that, somebody who should have published a couple of books. There was almost nobody like that because of September 6th. Right? The whole generation of Mormon intellectuals either got excommunicated or other people decided that's not for me, right? It's too dangerous. I'm not going to touch that. And so there's no middle generation. There's nobody in between Richard Bushman and me. I mean, there are a few other people like Terrell Givens. He could have gotten that job, but they wanted a historian. They didn't want a literary scholar and theologian. So Terrell actually just didn't fit the job description. But there's almost nobody in that middle generation. So all of a sudden, in 2011, I get this Mormon Studies chair. I'm 35 years old. There's no reason it should go to me. It should have gone to a much more senior scholar, but there was nobody there. There were a couple of other options and things didn't work out because of individual circumstances. So all of a sudden it just falls to me.
I mean, when I think about the fact that you say, you were a little too young at BYU to have been impacted by what happened earlier, and what you just said about there being a totally missing generation, it makes me think that from the church's perspective, the purge worked.
It did. There was a whole generation. There was a whole generation of intellectuals that's missing.
So the church did the best thing for itself, and it was effective.
It was effective. I'm not sure it did the best thing in the long run.
So you're saying effective short term, maybe kicking the can down the road.
It worked.
Yeah,
it worked for their goals in the immediate moment, right?
There's a book in there that's a dark. What we just talked about for the past 2 minutes to me, is a very dark and sad thing that I don't know is coming across.
I'm going to be writing an essay about this for Dialogue coming up.
Really?
Some of this, just from my perspective, right? I can't speak for other people.
Like the consequences of the
exactly.
church.
Basically, a whole generation. My career. I mean, and this is a perverse way of thinking about it, but my career, in many ways, is made possible because there was no generation ahead of me.
Yeah.
I should have in 2011, I should have still been laboring in obscurity. You don't get endowed chairs after writing one book. You get them after writing 2, 3, 4, 5 books, right? So, but there were some, and because of individual circumstances, it didn't work out, right? But there weren't very many people ahead of me in line.
Really quickly, I just want to ask you about this one thing. So there's this idea that Leonard Arrington hires all these scholars in the Camelot years of church history from like 72 to 82. Eventually that gets shuttled in 82. A bunch of those professors get sent to BYU, including Michael Quinn.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then when the September 6th happens, like we just discussed, it sends this big chill. A bunch of people get cut off and kicked out, and then a bunch of other people just shy away.
They opt out. Yeah.
They opt out. Yeah. I remember when I entered this domain learning about, like, there was this kind of, and I think it was Tom Kimball or Dan Witherspoon or a combination that told me about this, that like at some point, some super wealthy Mormon down at Arizona State University was looking to set up some type of chair or position for Mormon studies. And that I think Michael Quinn would have gone up for it, but because he had been excommunicated, he was Yale trained, super distinguished,
well-published.
Careful, well-published, even faithful.
Yeah.
And he was somehow blackballed or denied the ability to even get the position. And I'm sure I'm slaughtering the history on this, but it was sort of, well, I guess what I'm saying is when you were considering this fork in the road of whether or not to do Mormon studies versus African-American studies or whatever, I am sure that there were all sorts of people saying, stay away. This is a tar baby. This is radioactive. Mormon studies is the last thing you want to pursue, number one. And there probably aren't a lot of jobs in it. And it's probably going to be a super lonely road. Do you want to talk about any of that, including the idea that there was a bias with these endowed chairs, that they were usually funded by rich, faithful Mormons, and that made it so non-faithful ex-Mormon scholars weren't even really candidates. So that's a lot to ask you about. But
so if I don't get to some of that, just prompt me again. And
maybe I got it all wrong. So correct me.
No. So in terms of my own, this choice to like, am I going to do Mormon history? And I didn't have to make that choice. I was still straddling that line. I mean, like my position at the American University in Cairo, I was just like an American historian, right? And then I published that first book. So it was when the job offer came, like, oh, do I really want to do Mormon studies? Is that like, is that what I'm going to do? But certainly there was always the fear, like, will Mormon history actually get you jobs in the academy? And there was a big question about that. There's still a big question about that. And that has to do with lots of different things. But I was very self-conscious about that. So one of the things that my generation, so again, I'm kind of on the leading edge of this new generation of scholars who came up, people like Paul Reeve and Spencer Fluman or contemporaries, and what we all learned in grad school is, you can write about Mormons, but you can't just write about Mormons. You have to put it within a broader context, right? It can't be like what Arrington and all those guys were doing in the 70s and 80s, the new Mormon history. It can't be that. They were so good with primary sources and uncovering sources, but it was always like Mormon history for Mormon history's sake. And we learned in grad school, you can talk about Mormonism, but it's got to tell a bigger story. It's got to be situated within a bigger story. So my book is really about violence and religious intolerance and vigilantism and kind of big themes in Southern history and American history. Spencer's book, and Paul's books, they're addressing bigger questions, not just Mormon questions. So partly is we learned as a kind of new generation that we had to ask questions in different ways. But then, when this job came along, and so there were these series of chairs that were started in the 2000s. The two main ones in the 2000s were the Leonard Arrington Chair at Utah State, and then the Hunter Chair at Claremont. And you're absolutely right; they were both funded I think entirely by Latter-day Saints. I don't know how much non-LDS
Faithful, right?
money. Faithful Latter-day Saint money. And at Claremont, the donors were, it was always an interesting dance between the donors and the university, which is oftentimes the case with private money coming into universities for all kinds of things, right? Whether it be the Koch brothers or whoever. I mean, it's a big question for higher education. But in this case, you have these faithful Mormon donors who obviously they wanted certain things out of this. You have a secular university, graduate university with a sterling reputation in the study of religion, that wants certain things as well. So how do so it was on a personal level, it was a really good relationship between those people, but intellectually and ideologically, I mean, they wanted slightly different things. And the way that the LDS donors put it is they said, we do want somebody who's committed, a committed Latter-day Saint in this position. And the way that they framed it, and I think this was a winning argument for the university, they said, you wouldn't put a Holocaust denier in a chair of Jewish studies, right? So they were always worried about the quote-unquote anti-Mormon scholar, whoever that would be, right? Whoever they had in mind, whether a real person or somebody down the road, right? They were actually very much thinking about the future. What does this look like 20 years from now, 50 years? An endowed chair is permanent. And so for them, they wanted to say, hey, we fully understand this is academic. There's going to be full academic freedom in this position, but we want to take care that this, again, the Holocaust denier parallels. I heard that over and over in multiple meetings, and the university said, fine, we get that, we can agree to those terms. So you're exactly right. So far these chairs have been, and then the third chair was the Richard Bushman Chair at the University of Virginia, and then there's a professorship. It's a little different kind of. That's Kathleen Flake, and then Paul Reeve holds a professorship in Mormon Studies at the University of Utah. It's a little bit different, structured a little bit differently, but so far, all of the holders of these chairs have been committed Latter-day Saints.
Who's at Claremont now?
Matt Bowman.
Matt Bowman.
Yeah. So when I left Claremont 3 years ago, he took my place.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think it's a really interesting conversation. At some point, one of these positions is going to go to a non-Latter-day Saint scholar who has shown a record of excellence in Mormon studies, but who's just not a Latter-day Saint. And I can list off a number of people who I think would be outstanding candidates for these positions. So sooner or later, I hope sooner, I think it'll be healthy for the field once one of these positions goes to a non-Latter-day Saint.
I wonder if a Matt Harris would ever be a candidate for a position
possibly,
like that, because I love Matt.
His work is excellent. I mean, so John Turner, Laurie Maffley Kipp, Sarah Patterson, I mean, Quincy Newell. I mean, I can go down the list of outstanding non-Latter-day Saint scholars of Mormonism.
I guess there's a part of me that thinks that a never Mormon scholar is going to have a better chance than an ex-Mormon scholar.
I think in the short term, I think that's probably true.
Yeah, and there's a part of me that's sad about that, but I also know we live in the
real world. Right.
Okay. Really quickly, before we end this segment and then jump to kind of the deep dive Q&A, I want to chronologically talk about some of the events that you would have been a witness to as an awakened follower of Mormonism and Mormon studies, and just get brief reactions to those events.
Yep.
So, okay. So you begin working at American University at what year?
In Cairo. So I was in Cairo from 2007 to 2009. So I missed Prop 8. I was out of the country for Prop 8.
Let's start with Prop 8.
Yeah.
So when Prop 8 happens, summarize your emotions and feelings about Prop 8.
It's actually really interesting because I was out of the country. Like I was a young professor, living in a foreign country, new father in 2008. So I was aware of Prop 8 happening. From Egypt, I didn't understand what a big deal it was. Like on the ground for people in California and Utah, I had friends back here and so forth, and we would talk. But again, I was like so overwhelmed with life. And it was so remote from my experience there that it was like I knew it was happening. It was I read the news reports about it, but I really was distant from the visceral, emotional, kind of personal conflicts around pride. So when I really got it, when I fully understood Prop 8 was when I moved, not just back to the United States, but when I moved to California in 2011. So this is 3 years after it happened, and people in my ward are still talking about it, right? And I had an elders quorum president, excuse me, great guy who I really liked, and this was out of character for him, but he, I remember him like kind of a fist thumping emotional testimony in Elders Quorum where he said, like, if you don't get a testimony of Prop 8, you need to go get on your knees and go get a testimony of Prop 8. This is in 2011, 3 years later, right? It's done, right? And so that's when I was like, oh, wow, like this thing was real. This was not, so I had the luxury, because I was in Cairo, it was a bit of an abstraction at the time. Definitely not an abstraction once I got to Southern California in 2011.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me back up a tiny bit. So the bloggernacle emerges in 2003, 2004 with By Common Consent, Times and Seasons, Feminist Mormon Housewives. Were you plugged into that at all?
I was reading all that stuff, and I was an occasional guest contributor to BCC.
Okay.
And then I was also, what I really got plugged into was the dialogue community. So I was a member of the board for dialogue before I went to Egypt. And then I had to step down. I just couldn't be an active board member. Well, I was living in Egypt. And then when I came back, then I rejoined the board and eventually became chair of the board for a time. So
okay. People are probably going to hammer me for asking a self-serving question, but when Mormon Stories comes out in 2005, was that something that you would have even started listening to or paying attention to?
Vaguely aware of, but not a podcast listener. So I wasn't avoiding it. Like I just wasn't, it wasn't on my radar.
Okay.
But I mean, it was on my, like I knew it existed. I wasn't actively consuming it. I apologize.
No. No, I'm just curious.
No, I know.
What you,
Yeah.
Okay. So,
I was at that point, especially in the 2000s, it was all through the blogs that I was engaging in these, other than the academic scholarship. So that's what I was going to Mormon History Association. So I was very much involved in the academic Mormon studies stuff and Mormon history stuff. And then the blogs were my kind of extracurricular engagement.
Okay. So it was like the Swedish Rescue happens and the Hans Matson stuff and Marlon Jensen and Rick Turley going down to Sweden to try and keep Sweden, the Swedish Mormon Church, from hemorrhaging. Yeah. Would that have been something at the time you were aware of?
Yeah, because that was, what year was that? Do you remember?
Oh, I'm going to say 10, 11, 12.
So that's, so I got into, when I first went to Claremont, again, all this stuff was still percolating. There were no gospel topics essays yet in 2011 and so forth. So when I went to Claremont, I went with very much kind of single-minded, like, I am here to be a scholar of Mormonism. Like, that is my job, just to be a historian. And always been an active member of the ward, so like, I'll go to church and so forth, but it's like, I'm just here to be a scholar. But it was shortly after that, probably 2012 or 2013. So I was very aware of the Swedish Rescue. Mormon Moment happens in 2012 with Mitt Romney and all that kind of stuff. I'm barraged with media. So just because my job title has Mormon in it, right? And because I don't teach at BYU, so I can actually talk to the media. There's tons of people who are informed who can talk to the media, but it's hard for BYU professors and church employees to do so. So they all end up calling me at Claremont. So I do tons of media stuff with all that. And then about that time is when Tom Griffith, the former federal judge, amazing guy, he reaches out to me and says, hey, Terrell and Fiona Givens and Richard and Claudia Bushman are going to go out and they're going to start giving firesides addressing faith crisis stuff.
Is this called the Temple Observatory?
Temple and Observatory Group was like the umbrella.
What year was that?
2012, 2013.
Okay.
somewhere in there. And
that's when you start becoming really aware that the faith crisis problem.
That's when I get in the faith crisis conversation. So Tom reaches out to me. We have lunch in Provo, and he says, Terrell and Richard are going to go out. At first they were traveling together, and then there was just so much demand. They split up, and they each got a junior partner, like the junior companion.
Terrell and Fiona started going on separate.
So they ended up doing separate things. At first, the Bushmans and Givens were doing things together. Then they separated. So Tom asked me to come along basically as the junior companion to the Bushmans. Which I did a few times. So that was my first entry into this kind of faith crisis conversation. Long story short, eventually that leads to me writing Planted and publishing in 2015.
Okay. So after the Swedish rescue happens, that's when Marlin Jensen gets involved.
Yeah.
That's when I'm commissioned along with like Travis Stratford and Greg Prince to do the study on the faith crisis stuff. Let's just say that's 2010, 2011. Yeah. Did you start getting looped into, did you get to know Marlin Jensen? Mm-hmm. And when the Gospel Topics Essays sort of project might have been first envisioned, and then it was starting to be potentially shopped around or promoted, were you kind of on the inside by that point?
Yeah, so I was a participant. I was a contributor in the early phases of the Gospel Topics Essays. From the beginning? Yeah. So I was part of the process specifically on the essay on violence, what became the kind of Mountain Meadows essay. When they first envisioned it, so I actually spent an entire summer doing research and writing for this. They originally envisioned that essay as not being about Mountain Meadows because they'd already published their Mountain Meadows massacre book, the Turley Walker Leonard book. And so originally they said, the book basically speaks for itself, right? Let's talk about all the other stuff, right? All the other instances of Latter-day Saint violence against others in the 19th century. So that I spent a lot of time working on that. They ended up moving directions with the essay. They pivoted the essay back towards Mountain Meadows. But I'd done all that work for them. Eventually, the research I did there became the core of my book that I published, the book called Mormonism and Violence, that I published with Cambridge University Press. So, I was there kind of at ground level as they were doing those Gospel Topics essays.
What are you able to share about like the fear or the reasoning or the complexities of getting that project kind of off the ground?
Yeah, well, I can only talk about the conversations I had with them, right? I wasn't in the room for most of the conversations, but as it was communicated to me, it was basically like, hey, we've identified these 10 or 12 issues. I think a lot of it came out of the research that that you and Travis and others had done. Like these are the issues that come up most often. Did
it start with there's a problem?
Yeah, there's a problem. Right.
How would that have been described?
Well, the people are leaving the church over these questions, and so how are we going to respond? And the way that it was presented to me from the very beginning is like, how are we going to respond in a way that is historically accurate, that is transparent and forthright? There was very much a spirit, and I think this very much came down from Marlin Jensen of like, let's just tell the story. And the first envisioning of that project is that we would write long essays, like academic article length, and then there'd be like a medium version and then a short version. That all changed, and we ended up basically with just the short versions of each of these essays. So, I know all of those essays, or at least most of them, at least there were long versions of them originally that then eventually became the short versions that became online. And but the conversation all along was like, and they told me, and my sort of brief was, lay it out all on the table, and you've got access to our resources. So I was working in the church history department that summer. They said, if you need sources, let us know. We'll go get it for you. And you write the story that's there. And like there were no bumpers, on the lane. So
did you ever get a sense of sort of like contrition or ownership around this sort of narrative? and this would be my narrative, but it's like Fawn Brody comes out with their book in 45, they excommunicate her. You know, Lowell Benyon starts doing his stuff at, you know, in the CES and whatever, and he's kind of like marginalized. Like Leonard Arrington does his stuff from 72 to 82, and that's shuttled, and he's not even like released in general conference. Yeah. And the September 6th happens, and they excommunicate them all along with the purges at BYU. Sort of like, was the Essays Project enacted with, did you get a sense of like ownership and contrition that we as a church have been not being honest about our history, knowingly hiding or whitewashing or keeping information from the members and punishing those who talk about it, such that, oh, now it's 2011 or 12, now it's time to like atone for what we've done and now be open and honest. That, and I know I'm making some polar questions here, versus like, the internet's kicking our butt. You know, X, Y, and Z people are really making us look bad. So now we've got to come up with a response. There's kind of a soul-searching ownership.
Contemplative,
What's that?
Like contemplative, processing, taking ownership.
Yeah.
Responsibility.
Yeah.
I hope you understand the question. There's a question in there somewhere.
Versus like self-protective a little bit, or how do we stop this?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and of course, my conversations, I wasn't in the senior level conversations at all, right? I was working mostly with church history department employees and with some interactions with Elder Jensen and Rick Turley, who was the assistant church historian at the time. And so the sense that I got was very much like we want to address the current questions that people have, right? Very much this is a... Here's a problem. Let's address it. But it was also there. It was part of a longer story, because remember, you know, they'd already done the Mountain Meadows book by this point, right? So they'd already spent years and a lot of resources on the worst day in Mormon history and saying like, let's get that story right. The Joseph Smith papers had already started by this point, like, so major investment. In terms of saying like let's put the documents out there, so the gospel topics weren't they were part of a longer story of the church history department. I think internally, and I do give both Elder Jensen and Rick Turley a lot of credit for like leading this and shepherding this through, with all the politics involved in that, of saying like, let's turn a new leaf. And I know that Elder Jensen and Rick are well aware of that history, and feel like it was time to turn a new leaf, right? And so it wasn't going to be with sackcloth and ashes, but rather it was very much the spirit of we believe the church is true. We believe that God is working in and through the church, and so we don't have to hide our history.
Do you have a sense for whether this was a hard sell for Marlon Jensen and Richard Turley to make? Whether there was a lot of opposition, whether it was warmly embraced and accepted, or something in the middle?
I don't have it. I mean, I've talked with Marlon about this since. It was a sell, but what he's represented to me is that the senior leadership of the church, they understood that something should be done. And then I think there were differences of opinion, and we see the way that this played out. There were differences of opinion on, should this be on the front page of the website? You know, should it be the full 35-page essays or just the short one? So there were lots of differences of opinion, I think, in terms of the strategic rollout of this. But my sense from what Elder Jensen has represented to me is that they got buy-in to the concept right? And then, of course, the devil's in the details, right? The wording of a particular essay, how much do we say, but all of this, as you well know, it was all reviewed by the full Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency. But the concept itself of doing it, I think, was very much in line with. They'd already sold the senior brethren on this on the notion of a greater era of transparency. The Joseph Smith papers and the Mountain Meadows project had already, they'd already proved their worth.
Okay. How did you feel when you learned that the Gospel Topics essays were going to be written and were going to come out, as a historian and as someone who had studied those 40, 50, 60, 100 years of
I was excited. I was really excited. And I absolutely welcomed them then, and still think they're a great contribution. It's really hard for institutions to do that. And so it's, and I saw the level of commitment, the investment of personnel and resources to make this happen. So I really admired the project from the beginning. I mean, I was part of it, and very much I was happy to be part of it. Like, I felt like what we were doing really mattered.
Mm-hmm. Did you get a sense that there was a feeling or a motivation in this project of like, we're being misrepresented by our critics, and we want to tell the truthful history, or something different, which is like, wow, this history is problematic. A lot of people haven't been told it. We got to get ahead of it and spin it or finesse it or frame it in a faithful way.
Yeah. So I never heard even inklings of like spin, finesse, right? It was
frame.
it was all about like, how do we tell the story, but as part of the faith promoting story of the restoration, right? Of God's work in the world through the restoration. So it was, so in some ways, I think it was a mix of those two things that you were talking about in the sense of, we recognize that like the internet has changed the game, right? We don't control the narrative. And so if we don't tell a narrative, right? If we don't take a position on this, it means other people control that narrative for us. So I think there was definitely a realization of that, and it needed to be in an online space. The books weren't good enough, on their own. So I think there was a recognition of all of that. But of course, it's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is the church history department of the church. So how are we going to tell the history in a way that affirms the truth claims and the testimony of the church?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really quickly, do you remember watching the Ordain Women thing happen and
Very
culminating in Kate Kelly's excommunication, and what your thoughts and feelings were about that outcome?
Yeah. No, I watched that really carefully because I was getting calls from the media all the time to comment on it. I was never on the ground. I was in California, so I wasn't on the ground here in Utah attending any of the events. And I think this is just one of the issues that the modern church just continues to wrestle with women's roles in the church and women's equality and what do all these things mean. And so part of my education as in peace studies, you mentioned I have a master's degree in peace studies. So part of that was a lot of was taking classes like in nonviolent theory, nonviolent praxis, and so forth. And I'll just be honest, I always had a kind of, just personally, but also as a scholar who had studied nonviolent movements, I always had a kind of mixed reaction in terms of the efficacy and the sort of strategy behind some of their movements. I understood what they were doing. There's always this pull between the kind of the radical activist versus people working in more moderate ways, maybe inside and so forth. So I recognized that pull, and I recognized some of the strategies that they were taking. I wasn't always entirely convinced that they were going to be effective in the short term, in terms of actually making the kinds of changes within the church that they wanted and that they were calling for. But I absolutely understood and still understand everything that's behind it, right? And all of the frustration and all of the anger and the years of feeling like their voices absolutely were not heard, shut out from positions of power, all these kinds of things. So, so I think, people can debate and disagree about methods, but the impulse behind it, I absolutely recognize, and I'm friends with a lot of the women who were in that and part of that movement. So
yeah, and when like Kate was excommunicated, how did you feel about that?
Those things make me sad. Her excommunication made me sad. I like just on a personal level, right? Your excommunication made me sad. Natasha's excommunication made me sad.
Sam Young,
right? I mean, so yeah, go down the list. So I'm just personally sad. I want a church that's big enough that anybody who wants to worship with us has a place to worship with us. And, and at a certain point, some people don't want to worship with us anymore. Okay, that's fine too, right? I have some friends and colleagues who say excommunication is just like wrong. I would never excommunicate anybody. I don't go that far. Like the murdering child rapist, right? I mean, do you want to keep them on the rolls of the church, right? I actually think excommunication. I think there's a place for it in certain very extreme examples, but it makes me sad if, as a community, again, if people want to continue to be with us and stay in communion with the church. I know it's a little bit more Catholic language than Mormon language, but that we could find place. Now, I don't know. I've never met Kate, so I have no idea. I don't. At that point, did she want out? Right? What did excommunication? I've heard her talk about it, of course. So there's a politics to excommunication. Her movement was always meant to be very public. Excommunication and sort of moving towards that, and if you want to say forcing the church's hand or something like that, there's some strategic calculation behind that. But it's, to me, it's sad that it comes to that.
As you've watched, because we talked about the September 6th in 93, you would have known about that. It was hard not to conceptualize 2014, 2015, 2016, Bill Reel, Sam Young, all that, Denver Snuffer, Kate, me, others, as like another purge. As you were sad about seeing critics or activists being purged, I'm sure you had thoughts about whether that was going to be effective for the church or whether that would be counterproductive or even have negative long-term consequences. Did you or do you now have thoughts about that?
Yeah, and I think each of those cases is slightly different, right? They each have their own personality. They have the individuals involved and the issues and the way that they all came about. So we could
have Gina Colvin there too.
Right. And so they're all slightly different. I'm a peace builder at heart, and I would like for there to be ways, if possible, for some of these things to get resolved without something so harsh and definitive as an excommunication. I think for some of these individuals that we've talked about, they may have just left on their own, right? They may have, at a certain point, and this actually is going to be a question I may ask you later on. At what point do you just say, I can't in good conscience leave my name on the records of this institution that I just fundamentally disagree with, right? and then that becomes a voluntary act, which is very different. Again, I'm not a person who thinks that there's never a time for excommunication, but I would like to think of it as last resort. And in some of these cases, I'm not always sure, was it a last resort? Was it necessary? Were there other ways that as the body of Christ and as the Church of Jesus Christ, are there other ways that we could have ministered differently to some of these individuals? And I recognize, it's just so complex, and there are hurt feelings, and there's frustration, and the church feels attacked, and the church feels like it needs to preserve its good name. So I understand it's just enormously complex with deep feelings. I wish we were better at transforming conflicts constructively, and sometimes ecclesiastical discipline is an easier way to take, an easier path than sometimes the hard work of transforming these conflicts.
Do you, and this might be repeating the question, it might not be, and you may have already answered it, but were there, or now reflecting back, do you feel like these purges, could have hurt the church or even made the problem worse for the church? Forgetting there might have been better ways to resolve it, but what about the outcome? Yeah,
my own personal view is that in most cases, these recent, these excommunications over the past 10 years, I think in general, they've been counterproductive.
How so?
I think they have...
There's the Streisand effect, first of all.
The what?
Streisand effect, where...
What is that?
So I guess Barbara, something like Barbara Streisand, there were some photos that were taken of her that she didn't like, but by trying to get them squelched, made more people look at the photos.
Okay,
it's kind of like the burning
that's
books.
Part of it. That's exactly right. And so the national media, comes and writes stories about this, right? And those stories, given the environment that we're in the 2010s and the 2020s, those stories are not gonna have the church's interests at heart. The church is not, there is no way the church comes across well in those statements, especially because of the church's, because they won't respond to the specifics. And I actually think there's something admirable. I think there's some good principles behind that. But they won't comment. So it means that the Washington Post, the New York Times, whoever, right? It means that the microphone is put in front of you or Natasha or Kate or anybody else, and you get to frame the whole story. You get to frame the narrative for the national media. That's not in the church's best interest from a public relations standpoint. And so then, especially in a broader culture that is secularizing, where there's just a widespread distrust of institutions, of anything that looks authoritarian, of anything that looks autocratic. You and Kate and Sam and Gina, again, all these people strike very sympathetic portraits in the national media. And I think each of you have effectively found ways to communicate in ways that strike that are part of the national culture, especially in the United States and Europe, to find language that resonates way beyond Mormonism, so that these issues aren't just Mormon issues anymore. It's about bigger. Why does the New York Times care about the church excommunicating one person? It's about a bigger story, and so. The church, given the media environment, given the cultural environment, the church is not going to win these public relations contests. So that's why I think it's counterproductive. It actually makes some of these individuals martyrs, and it draws sympathy to their causes. Whereas dealing with it on a quieter level, out of the media eye, might actually work better for the church. I'm just thinking purely tactically here.
I can't speak for others, but I did not want to get excommunicated. That was not an outcome I wanted.
Yeah.
It was hard staying in the church, but what about how it's affected maybe members and more progressive or
Yeah.
liberal. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, that's part of it, right? So there's the broader media story, and then there's the broader cultural story, and so, but then internally within the church, I think people who are look, there are a lot of people within the church who are sympathetic to any of these causes, right? Whether it be women's equality, whether it be the kinds of things that Mormon Stories does, right? Transparency around, the history and doctrine and things like that. Whether it be Sam Young and clergy interviews and things like this. So there are lots LGBTQ issues, of course, right? So there's a wide swath of people within the church who are deeply committed to the church, right? 100% committed to the church, but have deep sympathies on these issues, either on an intellectual level or a personal level, right? And so. So then you or Gina or Sam or Kate become a kind of personification of an issue, right? And a set of relationships and a set of experiences that they've had in church. And so when an individual gets excommunicated, then naturally that person who has at least some sympathy, right? They may not be they may not be dialed up to 11, right? But maybe they're at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 on a particular issue. They say, if there's no room for John, Kate, Sam, et cetera, in the church, where does that leave me?
Yeah. And one of the biggest criticisms I get is forever kind of making it about me, but I think the past 10 years have been, we're going to get to in our next segment how the church seems to be in kind of a world of hurt right now, as are many religions.
Right.
but we're having a tough time.
Yeah.
And so it's in that context. And this is, we're about to wrap up this segment, but maybe I'll just ask maybe a final question. Hoping people will forgive that there's some self-referential stuff here in this interview, but it's part of why I wanted to interview you, just to talk about these sorts of things. But when did you first get a sense that, because you were like, you talked about at BYU when you take this Mormon studies class, you're like, oh, we behind us, right. Hinckley and yay, and everything's good now, and then you're studying this stuff and you don't see where the problem is. And then I wonder if there's a point where you were like, whoa, things are really serious. Wow, the church might even be starting to hemorrhage. This might even start to rise to the level of an existential threat. Maybe not. If the Quakers or Shakers or whoever are still around, like, the church isn't going anywhere, but right. But at the same token, I wonder if there was a point where you're like, whoa, this is way more serious and even starker, dire than I ever thought. And if so, can you talk about if you ever reached there, and if so, kind of when and how? And
oh yeah, for me it was the mid 2010s. It was when I started. Started with Richard and Claudia doing these firesides around faith crisis. When I wrote Planted, I've done dozens, hundreds. I don't know how many firesides I've done, and talking to individual people and so forth.
Maybe hundreds?
Maybe. Not hundreds, but maybe over 100. And
were these funded by Griffiths and his, friends?
So the Temple and Observatory group, ones the early the Givens and the Bushmans, them traveling around doing things. There was a funding structure for that, not from the church. It was private donors. I don't know who the donors were, who funded that. And then and I only did a handful of those. And then it turned into just the regular church fireside circuit where I just get invited by a ward or a stake, or done a lot of trainings for stake presidencies or bishoprics or, ward councils, how do we deal with these kinds of questions? So if you include all of that kind of stuff, it's definitely over 100. I've never sat down to count. So a lot of that stuff, in addition to countless individual conversations and phone calls and meetings and Zoom calls and stuff like that. So it was that 2013, and it was interesting when I first started doing these firesides. because the gospel topics essays were just coming out, but there was still like nothing, like that was it from the church's perspective. So Mormon Stories was there, some other blogs and other podcasts and other things were there on the sort of raising these kinds of questions side. There was very little in terms of meeting. I guess Fair Mormon was active, but and I remember at every single one of these firesides, we always did Q&A at the end. And it was always the best part. People could ask anything and talk about anything. And I remember in every single one, everybody would always say where can we get more? Like people were starving for content.
Why wasn't Fair Mormon? They had their website up with a gazillion questions and answers, right?
Well, they had their conference. They have their annual conference.
But for probably 2 decades, they've had a website with like all the big problems and all the answers.
I've never been part of that community.
Yeah.
I've spoken at the conference once, but I've never been part of that community.
But somehow that wasn't solving the problem.
It wasn't enough. It certainly wasn't getting out enough. And these people, I tell you, were starving for conversations, for answers, for perspectives. Right? And they always said, like, when's the book going to come out? And I always said, there is no book. There's just fireside. Like I have a day job, right? I'm just an academic. I'm just a professor. And I'll never forget, I was doing a fireside in Sandy, actually in my mom's home stake.
Oh, wow.
And this woman asked the same question that I'd heard dozens of times. Like, when are you gonna write a book, or when are you gonna do something? But like, there was so much like pain and hurt and longing in her eyes, like for more. She's like, when are you gonna write the book? And like, just like the Spirit hit me, I was like, I guess I'm writing the book. And so then that was the genesis of Planted. So I wrote that in 2014, 2015, like early in the morning before I went to work. I got up early before the rest of the family, worked on that. And finished it while I was in Romania on this Fulbright. I was actually writing it with the church has a rented villa there that we held sacrament meetings in. So I got the keys to that, and I wrote a lot of Planted in that building in Romania. And so that was just like my labor of love. It's like there's so much pain, there's so many questions. People are just starving for anything, and so who am I? Like I'm just like this professor. I'm like this. In my 30s, right? I'm like, who am I? But I just felt called, and so I'll write this book, and so that's and Deseret Book had just published Crucible of Doubt by Terrell and Fiona Givens, so that was the first time that a church press had really addressed these issues, And so then I pitched Planted to them right about that time. They picked it up. Deseret Book was fantastic to work with. They were starving for this content. They told me they were waiting for a book manuscript that would do something with the gospel topics essays. So they existed out there, but not very many people knew about them. Nobody had really done much with them. So Planted makes use of those essays, and so they were really excited when that. I didn't know anybody there. I was a total unknown. So then that manuscript came across their desk. But for me, it just like it was that woman's question, like seeing her eyes and just saying like, okay, I've got to be in this space.
What was the response to Planted, and what role has it played from what you can tell? If you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, it's been phenomenally positive.
Do you know how many units have been sold by chance?
I'm like the worst businessman in the world. I know it's north of 20,000, but I don't know how far north of that. And so books. There will be more people to listen to this one episode than ever listen. I mean, and how many hours did I spend writing Planted? I mean, it's a weird world we live in, right? It is, yeah. But no, it's had. And I didn't know, because again, this was like a new thing. And this is so recent, right? 2015. That's only 7 years ago, right? We're talking about like it's ancient history. That's 7 years ago, yeah. Right? It's amazing how fast time goes. But like I didn't know what to expect. Like I just put it out into the world because I felt like I needed to, felt called to, but the reaction has been phenomenal. I mean, the best thing about it. I've had so many people reach out to me, and because of that, I've given lots of firesides and things like that. But the best thing, and this has happened like countless times, where somebody comes up to me afterwards, after a fireside, or they email me or they call me or say something like that, and they say, we read Planted, and it's one of two things. It's either a child who's left the church or the parents of the child. One of the two reaches out to me, and they said, we couldn't talk to each other, right? I'm like, our relationship, because this child had left the church, or sometimes spouse, but usually child, our relationship was so frayed, was so, sometimes like we'd cut off contact with each other, and there was so much pain. And then one or the other either the parents read the book and gave it to the kid, or the kid read the book and then gave it to the parents, and they said, we can talk to each other now. And so many people who have gone, in the first chapter of Planted, I sort of describe what I call the anatomy of a faith crisis. I mean, everybody's experience is different, but I try to generalize some of the things that go into it. And I've had so many people say, like, that was the first time that I felt seen by, it's published by Deseret Book and the Maxwell Institute. Like, so from an official church source or voice and by somebody in the church, right? It was the first time that somebody described my experience in a way that I recognized and that felt, that didn't feel judgmental, that just described what it was like to go through this. And again, I mean, it's so weird for me to hear it because I haven't gone through that, right? But it was just from hearing countless people's stories. I mean, that's partly what I do as a historian, right? I mean, I haven't lived through everything in history, but I read enough data, and then I try to be able to describe it and make sense of it. That's what I do as a historian. So he gathering all these stories and listening to them, trying to make sense of them, trying to listen with love and empathy, and then trying to put that on the page of what it actually not only looks like but feels like. And so to have all these people say, like, yeah, you got it right. And now I can talk to my parents again.
Yeah. I'm thinking about some of the early attempts I made to try and solve this problem, whether it's the Stay LDS website or the essay that I wrote on how to stay in the church after a crisis of faith that I put out on Stay LDS, or those, I don't know if you remember those YouTube videos I did about why people leave the church and how we can help.
Yep.
I've just, I'm almost 20 years into this stuff I've been doing, and I've just been reflecting a tiny bit about it. And I was kind of wondering, before 2004, 2005, all the Sunstone stuff, all the dialogue stuff, had there been a lot of discussion about faith crises and, what it is and how to deal with it? Or is that really something that emerged mostly in the 2000s? And before then, it was just arguing over truth claims, and then people disappear if they don't believe anymore.
I think that I might be missing something, but my sense is that, no, it's a 21st century. I think it's an internet thing. I think the internet changed everything. And so obviously people left the church before that, right?
Yeah.
Obviously people left the church over truth claims or social. I mean, we know that lots of people left the church over the church's racial policies and so forth. So the general contours I don't think have changed, but it always seemed, again, I'm a little bit spitballing here, but I think I'm right. I think before the advent of the internet, it was so isolated that everybody thought it was just isolated, right? When it happened, it was also much harder to access information, right? So much easier to access it on Google than it is to go to a university library or something like that. So I think the knowledge of some of the controversial issues was much less, especially the historical and doctrinal issues, and then just because everybody. It's hard to remember, and I mean, you guys have kids. I like trying to tell my kids what it was like before the internet, right? Yeah. It's like it's so hard for people to remember what that was like, let alone to communicate to kids who never experienced that. But you didn't know what was going on 5 miles away, let alone 50 miles away or something like that. So I think maybe the contours of faith crisis, they always existed. We always know people have coming in and out of the church for lots of different reasons. But the internet I think just ramped up the scale, the scope, the visibility.
I think, and we're just kind of chatting and we're going to end in just like 2 minutes. But the other thing that I would add to that the internet did when the church was able to do clampdowns and purges in the 40s or in the 60s or in the 90s or 80s, whatever, like you said, it would just be like entire generations would disappear. There'd be silence for 10 or 20 years. Everyone would be terrified of what happens if they speak out. It seems like the internet made it impossible, made it much harder for the church to do a clampdown that would be effective, because with the internet, people could organize, people could share information, and people could fight back to, let's just say, unjust or disproportionate or unkind actions by the church to try and squelch it. Is that fair?
No, the internet not only democratized information, but it democratized a sense of power and community, right? And knowledge, not just propositional knowledge, but like knowledge of what's going on.
Yeah.
So like how many people really knew what was going on with Lil Benyon, right?
Yeah. Right. Or even Eugene England.
England, like some, it was written up in the papers. September 6th definitely made national news, right? But you could ignore it if you wanted to, right? You could say like that's somebody else's problem, right? Or that's 6 intellectuals.
Yeah.
At BYU. I mean, that's like,
Or if you read the Deseret News, maybe it's not even that covered that much, right?
Yeah, that's actually, I'd be really interested. What was the Deseret News' coverage of the September 6th? I don't know that. I've never looked at it. It'd be really interesting to know. So exactly. So if you exist in that world, so if you're in Utah and you're only reading the Deseret News and the church
bubble,
news,
we call it the bubble,
right? Or if you're outside of Utah, where you're not getting hardly any news about the church because you're a tiny little minority. Right, you don't know that any of this stuff is going on.
Yeah.
So the internet sort of immediatizes everything. Like it feels like everything is like right there in front of you. Of course, it's information overload sometimes, but the internet shrinks the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you add to that the ability to organize, to share information and organize.
That's right.
I think that's what's turned the tables a little bit and caused this relatively modern phenomenon of the faith crisis.
Yeah, because, Sunstone and Dialogue existed before that, but those have always been very small communities, like in the hundreds or thousands.
Yeah. No more than 10,000 probably at any one point.
Yeah.
Mark, you've been really patient. We've got lunch here. Anything you want to say really quick?
Yeah, here's a reflection. I'm going to try and see if I can formulate this thought concisely. So I was thinking about you sharing how you had this moment at that gathering in your mom's stake.
I think it was a stake.
The stake.
Fireside, yeah.
And you had that woman stand up and pose this question, and you feel her pain. And I was thinking about, as you've talked about your story with us and that BYU class you had where you were taken through history with the church and kind of all these. And I was thinking about as a historian, and someone who has some sense of privilege, while you're hearing these stories, how different it is to have firsthand accounts where you're feeling the pain of someone in front of you. So what would have happened in that class if you had this is just exploring an idea. I'm not saying they should have done, but like someone, an indigenous person talking about how it impacted them to have this place in history, with the Mormon Church doing, or where you're face to face. There's something about that, right? Where you're face to face to someone suffering and you're seeing it kind of come through. And I know when I'm thinking about that with John and our story and with the faith crisis, and he starts the podcast, and clearly he's having some suffering with the person he's interviewing. Oftentimes there's meeting there, but it really it popped a balloon of suffering that we were not aware in any way that was there, where he just got letters and letters and letters of people, LGBTQIA people, and what happens is you become now, it's like it pops your own bubble. And I heard that kind of in what you were saying, because kind of through it, you were like, that didn't shake me so much, or it didn't really affect me that much. But that moment where you're standing and you're witnessing firsthand someone suffering, you're looking in their eyes or you're hearing their story and it's in their voice, and it becomes different, doesn't it?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly right, Margie, that for me, one of the reasons I became a historian, as opposed to maybe a social scientist or something. No offense to social scientists, but like I'm interested in human beings, and I'm interested in people's stories. I'm interested in who they are, in what makes them tick, in their struggles, in their triumphs, and so and like we talked about it, this goes all the way back to my mission, where I was just like I was interested in hearing people's stories, and it's been a kind of recurring. That's why I love, as a historian, I always joke with my students, right? We read dead people's mail and diaries, right? But it's in an effort to like get to know this person, to humanize the dead, to recognize what the human condition is all about, and it's been so transformative for me. And being in that fireside with Jean England and all these Black saints in London, but especially over the past 10 years, as people have opened up and shared their lives with me and their pain and their hurt and their struggles, intellectually and emotionally and relationally and with the church and with families, like that. Talk about privilege! Like it is a privileged place to hear people's stories and for them to share their pain with you, and I want to be a good steward of what's shared with me, and I want to respond with empathy. I want to respond with love. I want to respond with validating that their experience is real. They didn't make this up, and that their pain is worth attending to. And so I'm really lucky I get to do that for my day job as a historian. I hope I convey this to my students, like to humanize the past. But I also feel deeply privileged and lucky. It's a burden too, as you know, right? For other people to share these things with you and for you to carry this with them. There's an emotional burden that comes with that too, but that's worth it. And I think that's what it means to be human.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been so fun for me. This is like what I live for.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things I've done a million times, but talking to you is not something I've done a million times. So part one has been brilliant. Margie, it's just so great to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you.
So
I love you.
happy
Yeah.
to be here.
And don't go away, viewers and listeners. We're going to do part two as soon as we eat our Jimmy John's. And we're not officially endorsed by Jimmy John's, but we're going to come back.
But would like to be.
Yeah, we'd like to be. No. I'm gonna ask Patrick a million questions, while still leaving time for part three, which will be Patrick turning the tables on me and Margie and asking us some questions. So, Patrick, this has been wonderful. I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Oh, yeah, this has been great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Come right back for part two. And we'll see you all soon on Mormon Stories podcast. Thank you.